to hop on that, for my understanding of what a trans person is, there is a very real internal understanding of gender. There is a male or female internal understanding of gender, and that is why gender dysphoria exists, is because you might have the external appearance or the sex organs of being a male or female, and you might even, quote unquote, play the part, and it might even be socially reinforced to some extent, but if it doesn't match that internal understanding of what your gender is, it becomes self-destructive, which is why these people should have like access to HRT, SRS, GAS, whatever. Like that's why we like help people transition or whatever. It's because that external doesn't match the internal content.
To be clear, I don't know if they actually identify as a deer person. I think it's like
Well,
part me.
they
part...
do.
I
They
don't.
do.
I don't
They
think
clarified
so.
it. No, I asked and they said no, they literally identify as a deer. It's not like an affinity or anything like that. They legitimately identify
Wait,
as
are
a
you sure?
deer.
Because every time this is posted on my subreddit, there's like 3 people that always post this is fake DGG narrative. They don't actually identify as a deer. They just made it up.
Let me see. I'll grab the tweet so that I'm not so that this is all let's see here. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm sure listen, I'm sure someone in chat will find it. Okay. But no, I'm 98% sure that
Okay.
they do legitimately identify. So let's just go based off of that and then I can be held accountable
Yeah,
otherwise.
sure.
So, well, I assume you think that's ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you do. So I would say
Yeah,
yes.
of course.
Okay. And for it does because at the same time they'll say, well, there's nothing wrong even identifying like with an attack helicopter too, because these people think that language can just sort of be whatever the hell you want it to be,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is frustrating. But at the same time, I've sort of come to like I want to preface this by saying I don't think it really matters what someone I like it doesn't affect me, right? So if someone wants to say that they identify as a deer, I guess at the end of the day, it doesn't matter unless maybe you're a public figure and then it sort of gives people a bad name and then conservatives will start using those extreme examples to
Yeah,
like
I think
justify
if we lived
being
like in the
transphobic.
ultimate liberal society, maybe it wouldn't. But yeah, obviously these people have other impacts on the discourse,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's always hard to measure that sort of thing. Uh, like actually how much measurable impact is the Doe person going to have?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I don't know. But it is probably just better, I guess, to keep that to yourself and not go and argue that you can literally identify as these animals because yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, okay. But at the same time, I've sort of come to like, for example, I was talking to a professor recently, and the topic of, TERFs came up because that's sort of a problem that's sweeping. Like, that's like the hot button controversial issue in philosophy. And actually, I try not to take, I mean, obviously, I'm against TERFs and stuff, but if I'm actually talking to professors, I'm very, very hesitant to bring it up because there are like, it's like a fucking war. And there are some really big professors who have a lot of influence who are sort of pro. Do you know who Kathleen Stock is?
Nope.
She's basically the figurehead, and she got an OBE in the UK. She's a UK professor
Mm-hmm.
who's sort of like the paradigmatic turf. Basically says, I'm a feminist. I'm here to protect women, and trans women are not actual women.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the position, and I'm hesitant to when I'm in classes or talking to professors to sort of take stances on those issues in case, there's a lot of really powerful people with a lot of influence that will ruin your career
Mm-hmm.
if you are publicly and I know a lot of people who have been vehemently harassed. Yeah, yeah, sure, if I'm a coward, that's fine. Yeah, whatever. Um, but I was talking to a professor and they basically told me, like, I don't really define myself as anything. Um, like male, female, woman, man, deer. Um, and I'm sort of taken to that idea that, like, what do you define yourself as in reference to identity? Like, do you actually define yourself as a man?
I mean, I've actually talked about this for a long time. My gender's never really
Yeah.
been that important to me. I really don't care one way or another if I was a guy or
Right.
girl. It's not like something I think about. But I think for a lot of people, that's probably not the same.
Yeah.
Or it seems like some people, well, obviously trans people have huge like identification things related to their gender. So it seems like people have varying levels of attachment to whatever sex or gender they have or are, I guess.
Yeah, and it's weird because it seems like there's this sort of tension behind transgender people. I mean, this was the whole demon mama thing, right? Where basically you can identify with being uh, a woman for whatever reasons you want, whether that's an actual sort of essential pull that you're feeling internally, or if it's like for political reasons. And I know you did your whole thing about that. But because I originally came out and I was very vocal about the idea that, I mean, even though these
Wait,
notions,
I want you to think really hard about this point, Rem.
Okay.
Think really hard about this because I'm going to go
Yeah,
get
yeah.
a drink real quick. One sec.
Oh, right, okay. Any meaningful difference between TERFs in the USA and TERFs in Canada? Probably not, but if you go to the UK is like the land of the TERFs. I don't know what it is about Brit bongers. I don't know what it is. It's really, really strange. I don't know what the hell's going on in Britain that they just pump out. Like Canada produces the alt-righters who we then deport to the USA, and then the UK produces the TERFs. It's very strange. Yeah, maybe it's the weather. Maybe it's like it's so dreary and depressing in the UK all the time that they undergo intense depression and they want to take out all of their frustrations about the rain on trans women. I think that's probably what it is. And same thing in Canada. It's so snowy here. It's so cold that alt-righters. Oh wait, oh
Okay.
hi.
Hi.
Um, what was that? Oh, right. Yeah, that there are these sort of people who say you can identify as whatever for whatever reason. I know I had originally been very much against this idea, but the more I think about it, the less necessary I guess I think it is. Um, do you think so? Can you give me your brief argument about why someone should be able to identify, for example, as a man or a woman for
Yes,
whatever
sure.
reason
So
they want?
I'm gonna go really far back,
Yeah.
epistemically. I think that
Oh, okay.
words need to map onto something. Otherwise,
Mhm.
language is meaningless. It can't. Everybody can't have their own definitions for things. Everybody can't be working with their own private language, right? Like, we need to have some shared, agreed upon stuff for what words mean. Do you agree with that? That needs to exist?
Yes, I mean that is initially what I believe, and that's why I came out so strongly about it. But then I thought about it perhaps a little bit more. And I mean it basically okay, so you and I enter a conversation
Well,
and
before maybe we'll see how much, because maybe we have more common ground or whatever.
yes, yes,
Words
yes.
exist. I think that they not only do they need to map onto something real, we have to be able to agree between two people.
What do you mean real?
Like
I'm not trying to be a
no, I
pain in the
understand.
ass.
Yeah, so there needs to be oh god, I don't know how. There needs to be like some common thing that is evoked in the mind between two people when a word is mentioned for that word to have something. So one of the big strengths is I should be able to go to a person and like I should be able to utter some description and they can get an image in their mind of something they've never seen before. So for instance, I can go up to a person and say, hey, listen, in the other room, you're going to encounter a black balloon with gold spots on it. And without having ever seen that thing before, they already know what they're looking for because we have like words that mean things is what I'm saying, right? And that I would say like foundationally, all of human communication, maybe even thought, I guess, depending on how, I guess Hegelian or whatever you want to get into it, like probably stems from some type of like shared language that we have. It seems to be the case to me. But that doesn't mean that the language could be malleable, though. So just because something is read today doesn't mean it has to be forever read. People can have different understandings of what read is. Like that's all a little bit malleable. We don't have a universal dictionary that our minds can all access. So this is a bit more fluid in practice, but the concept is still as real as I would say it would be. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and so I mostly agree with that. I mean, so when we enter a conversation, we both come in, this is a technical term, but I think it's common sense as well, like with these presuppositions about what certain words mean.
Hmm.
And if we both enter the conversation and our presuppositions don't match, the essential task, the communicative task that we have with each other is to whittle down the possibilities of what a certain word could mean until we are in agreement about what it means.
Yeah.
That's I think that's essentially, I mean, the task of communication in general is, I believe, the whittling down of possible worlds, if that makes sense. Like when we're having a discussion about something, if I'm asking, oh, what time are you going to go, to the laundromat or whatever, the task of us having that conversation is to whittle down the number of possible worlds that are going to take place, right? And that goes not just for, me doing a certain thing or finding out when you're going to do a certain thing, but also what we mean by certain words. So my argument against these people who say, that for example, that I identify as a deer,
Hmm.
um, would just be that you are being disingenuous when you enter the conversation, because necessarily when we have that discussion, we're going to mean two very, very different things by the word deer.
Hmm.
Because if you are genuinely identifying as a deer, you are broadening the scope of deer to include something that no one else does.
Hmm. To the
Because
point of
there's
meaninglessness, basically, right? Because now, well, what is
Well,
deer?
not me. This is the thing, and this is where I get a little, stuck on, because it's not meaningless. Because equally so, I could enter the conversation with someone like Doe, and they want to expand that definition to include whatever conditions she has to qualify as a deer.
Hmm.
Um, and I can agree to that definition, and therefore our presuppositions now match up. I mean,
Sure.
vice
Okay.
versa,
I'm doing an
we
extra.
can narrow it down.
Yeah, I'm doing an extra mental step here. Let me verbalize this, and then I'll see if you agree or disagree. So when I say it's become meaningless, what I mean is that if we have two categories, so one we have like human or people, and then in another one we have a category called deer. If we could, through self-identification or whatever arbitrary measure necessary, if we could expand the category of deer such that it includes people, whatever thought process that we employ to do that, if we were to universalize that thought process, we could probably expand almost any category to include almost anything else. And that's what I mean when I say it becomes meaningless. Like
Right.
these,
So
yeah.
it's not necessarily, because I can hear the people push back. Well, it's not meaningless for the reasons I
It's
said.
not technically
It's
meaningless, yeah.
irrational. It is being a poor communicator and being disingenuous, because I think the whole idea of definitions itself is we want to narrow down and get a more proper understanding of what a term means. That almost always means narrowing the definition.
Hmm.
Fish used to include a whale, right? And
Yeah.
then we realize, oh, it doesn't make any sense. We're going to narrow the definition of fish.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same thing with something like woman or man, in that we are identifying or trying to identify the characteristics of womanhood or manhood.
Hmm.
Um, and we actually find that those narrow definitions map onto more things than we thought. Well, in the case of identifying as a deer, you're expanding the conditions.
Hmm.
So that's where the two differences would lie there. But at the same time, talking to this professor, well, this is where we had left off. You said that you don't really identify or see yourself as having a certain gender. And I think I feel the same. I mean, I identify as non-binary mostly because when someone asks me, oh, well, are you a man? I'm like, I don't really know what the hell that means.
Yeah,
Like,
I guess the way that I kind of view this is that like these are conversations I've had before I even knew the term non-binary existed actually. But I guess like this is segueing into a totally different convo, so you can touch on this and then we can go back. But like
yeah, yeah.
in my preferred world, like I wouldn't really consider myself non-binary. I would just say that like the category of man is like expanded a bit such that you can include people that don't have like super strong like feelings of being a man. Like I generally wear masculine clothes and I generally like present in a masculine way. Like it's not the end of the world for me. Like if I wake up tomorrow and I was like a woman, I don't think I wouldn't care that much.
I,
But like
yeah,
but
I
like it would
would
be
not
cooler
for
that
sure.
like it would be cooler if like I would say like, "Oh, yeah, I'm a man." And that's included like very easily rather than like, "Oh no, there's another category for me. I'm non-binary." Right? Like it would be nicer to have that category be a bit more broad, but yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so I'm having trouble reconciling this intuition that you and I seem to share,
Mhm.
also with the intuition that someone like Demon Mama has, that you can identify for reasons other than that sort of, I guess you could call it like an instinctual pull. I don't know what better word, but clearly there's like Riley, for example, clearly identifies
Hmm.
with womanhood, right? And I can't understand that. Just like I can't understand someone like my friend who clearly identifies with being male. I can't understand that. So
Sure.
how do I reconcile that? Well, yeah, how do I reconcile the two things? That I don't really understand how we are naturally drawn instinctually to a certain gender, with the idea that we can't identify as something for reasons other than that instinctual pull. Because seemingly you don't think that, like, you disagree with Demon Mama on that point, right?
Wait, can you illustrate her point one more time? That
Well, correct. It's been a while, but correct
okay.
me. But that you're able to basically identify as a woman or a man, regardless of any kind of instinctual pull.
Oh yeah, so this idea, I think the Dear Lady shares as well. The idea is basically that you can identify as anything you want to, so long as you want to, or something.
And
That
is
sounds
that what
circular, but
Demon Mama holds too?
yeah, I hate her, but I'm not trying to strawman her. But I
Yeah.
legitimately think that that was her position, that anybody can identify as anything they want to, and it doesn't have to map onto anything whatsoever. Because when Riley tried to argue against that, when Riley tried
Well,
to
I
go, well,
think
hold
Riley's
on,
argument was really bad because
maybe, but
she started appealing to stuff like scientific realism and stuff, which just
yeah,
you're
potentially, but her argument was like hardcore philosophically flawed. But I think the
yes.
gist, the meat of what her argument was that it feels like gender experiences seem to map onto something real, and they're not just arbitrary social identities that can be whatever we want them to be. That seems to
Well,
be the
I
case.
agree. They so this is the thing I'm not sure. Do people like Doe and Demon Mama think that that kind of thing doesn't exist?
That's
Are
what
they
it feels
rejecting
like
that?
when that's it feels like that's the logical conclusions of their arguments. But then that my argument is always like, okay, but what about all the trans people that kill themselves because they don't feel that way? Because my next question is like, why the fuck are trans people? Why don't you just identify with the sex you are and then boom, we've solved trans issues? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so this is the thing is there seems to be a very clear middle ground here where you simultaneously recognize that there's two legitimate ways that you can come about identifying, which is one to say, yes, these people legitimately experience gender dysphoria and they are legitimately, they feel like they are women. And that's not mapping onto anything scientific or it's all social construct, but these are still real social constructs that have meaning, of course. And they're
Jesus.
clearly drawn to that. But then you can also identify if you feel like you or I do for other reasons, whether that's a pragmatic reason or not. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, kind of. So the thing that I would push on is that like not all self-identifications are equal because of the terms that we have.
Well,
But
forget,
things, yeah.
let's restrict purely to gender. Let's completely forget about identifying as things that lie outside human
Yeah,
bounds,
so
like
when it so
fear and stuff, 'cause
my
that's ridiculous. But
opinion based on everything I've seen and talked to and read or whatever is that there seems to be some gender binary that exists between male and female, and it seems to be that there is some internal experience that falls along that binary. That seems to be the case to me. So it seems like we have some pre-built dichotomy in our head of like developing masculine or feminine, and then we want our bodies to look a certain way to match that, and that seems to be really baked into the human experience.
well,
That
so it depends. Do you think that that is something like that's genetic, or do you think that that is more that happens from nurturing and from environmental conditioning?
I think that there might be some environmental conditioning that goes along with like how we express ourselves, but I think that a large part of that is given to us by biology.
Okay,
And
well,
you
you
might
know
disagree
where
with
I
that, but the
push
reason
back
why I would
there,
push
yeah.
hard against somebody that says no, it's all social conditioning is because I would, if you agree with that, or I'm curious, I'll ask you. So if you think a
Mhm.
large part of it is social conditioning, why can't we just make
Well, I think it's
camps?
all social
Okay,
conditioning.
if it's
I
all
am a
social conditioning,
scientific
why can't we just
educator.
make camps to trans people?
Why can't so no, because at the same time I recognize that these like you can't just overcome environmental conditioning.
Well, but you
That's
could with more environmental conditioning. That's why it's environmental conditioning, right? It's an external factor that we theoretically could change, right?
I so yeah, in certain cases, but at the same time, for example, if I'm environmentally conditioned to so yeah, so I don't completely disagree with you. And actually, this is a point that I brought up with something like pedophilia, right?
Hmm.
Where a lot of people, if you reject, if you accept, I mean, people got mad at me when I said that you should engage and support something like conversion therapy treatment for pedophiles because legitimately that actually seems like a legitimate form of solving that issue, and that's what the science seems to support. And at the same time, that means perhaps suggesting that something like conversion therapy for being homosexual or not is a possibility that, could occur if we admit that it is environmental conditioning. But that doesn't support, obviously, doing anything like that, because there's absolutely zero reason to, because it absolutely harms no one, right? As opposed to something like pedophilia, where all the stresses that exist in society can lead you to do something that is really, really harmful.
Here's
right?
a question. If there was a therapy available for people that were 18 that had like a 99% pass rate to untrans them, would you be in favor of that therapy?
I mean, that's up to them. I mean, if like, I don't think that there's anything wrong
Okay, let's
with
say,
someone
hold on,
choosing
let's
to
make
do
this more
that.
interesting. Let's say they were 12. Because now you've got it in the parents' responsibility. Let's say that there was a camp, I don't mean like a fucking torture electrician, like murdering camp, but let's say it was a normal camp. You go to like 4 hours of therapy a day when you're 12, and after one summer, it is guaranteed to make you a cisgender person. Do you think that that type of a camp would be okay or no?
This is sort of like asking, and like, I'm not evading the question, but I'm just trying to sort of better understand it in my mind. This would be sort of like asking, like, if we are able to genetically alter someone at birth, for example, in South Africa, do you think it would be okay for someone to select against race and like choose to be white instead of black in South Africa because of the benefits that it could bring to the child, right? It's that same type of scenario.
A little
And that's
bit,
what-
although I don't like that comparison, because whether you're black or white isn't necessarily intrinsically bad. Like, society could change completely.
Well, I don't
Whereas
think that there's anything intrinsically bad about being,
trans,
a man or are you saying that,
I think there's an intrinsic problem with transness, because there's a tension between your sexual expression and your sexual identity that you have to alleviate through HRT, gender reaffirming surgery, or gender affirming surgery, or SRS.
yes, but
whatever.
that's
Yeah.
because society imposes certain restrictions upon people who are quote unquote born as male and actually identify as a woman. So it's the same thing. I mean, it's societal forces that cause that type of
So this
harm in the
is
first place.
this is the classic question that I've always had, and it feels like you lean to one side of it. I don't know what the answer is, but do you think that there are people that exist today in society that are trans, that if society were different, they wouldn't be trans?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Of course.
Okay, hold on. Well, sure. That's a very controversial answer that you're giving.
Is that really controversial?
Absolutely.
I don't know why
That
that's
is insanely
controversial.
because I think
And also,
that-
let me say, I'm
yeah.
willing to, if I'm saying something horribly offensive, feel free, email me or whatever. I'm more than willing to, like, this is not something that I'm hardcore fighting for. I'm just exploring this. But yeah, go on.
I don't necessarily disagree with you. I don't have a strong opinion. I asked ContraPoints that question a long time ago, and she told me yes back then, but I think her feelings on it have changed. That's the impression that I get, and I don't know if I can talk to her again because I'm way too politically spicy. But that's something I've wondered for a long time. I don't know what the correct answer to that is. But if that is the answer, then that makes it feel like, because right now, my understanding and what a lot of people say is that gender is a very internal experience. But this makes it feel like gender is far more externally defined, that content is like, societally driven. If that was the case, then it, well, there's a lot of places you go with that, but that's an interesting question, right? Because I was going to say, like, so that means we could arguably design a society that's a little bit different, such that there are no more trans people, because instead of having trans women, you would just have men that have expanded categories of acceptable behaviors and presentations or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. So I was just getting a pen and paper just so I can.
So then this
track.
brings me back then to another, this is a very age-old question that I have, and I get very spicy responses or angry responses. So, like, what is the difference, for instance, then, between, like, a trans man and a tomboy?
I don't know, because I'm neither a trans man or a tomboy, and nor do I really know what they're actually identifying with. So,
Because I've had people explain
I'm not
to me
trying
that, like,
evade it. I don't know how to answer that question, because I don't really know what a tomboy is necessarily identifying with. Neither do I really know what a trans man is
well, a
identifying
tomboy,
with. Because,
so the difference is a tomboy identifies as, like, just a masculine female. You're a female with masculine or male hobbies, but a trans man feels like they are a male. They're not just like a masculine female. They want to be a male. And
and I get this is one of those things where I legitimately don't think I can answer, because I don't have connection to these things, to being a man, to being a woman. So there's something that they picked out a human behavior that they are identifying with and saying, oh, that's what we usually tend to understand as tomboy, and I'm identifying with that. And clearly I assume there's a distinction if we were to do a whole survey of trans men and tomboys where they would be identifying with different types of behavior within society. I assume that's what the answer would be. I don't know where the delineating line between those two things would actually be.
I don't know the answer to that either. That's a hard one. But I get very weird vibes sometimes then, because like all the trans stuff, like issues, transgender, sex ID versus sex presentation, all of that makes sense to me if I'm coming at this from a paradigm where I understand that gender is like an internalized experience. But as soon as people like Demon Mama or the Dear Lady start opening up the conversation to saying like, oh, well, actually anybody can ID as anything and like you can be whatever you want. In my view, this sounds, I guess, transphobic to say, but that totally delegitimizes the whole trans thing to me. In that case, I now absolutely don't care. Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if I necessarily agree. I don't know how that delegitimizes anything,
because
really.
I don't believe that anybody, and now this is just me being an asshole, I personally don't believe that anybody truly IDs as like a deer. I don't believe that.
No.
Unless you give me like a severe
agree.
instance, of childhood trauma where they were raised as deers.
Specifically about human identification. I want to.
Yeah. So when people start IDing as literally like attack
Yeah.
helicopters or IDing as like
that's all
omni-gender or
ridiculous.
whatever, when people start getting into weird shit like that, it's like, okay, well, if you want to build this off of, you want to use the same, and a big problem I have with these people is they want to use the same shared vocabulary as trans people. They want to build off those understandings.
No,
but
see, what that is that's just being lazy. That's saying I can't make the actual argument, so I'll just let anything go.
Well, but it's not
that's
necessarily
the
being
point.
lazy. What it is it's trying to co-opt those arguments. They're trying to say that, and then what it comes out as is that like, if you grant that trans people are real, you must grant that you can self-ID as anything. Otherwise, to reject one necessarily makes you basically transphobic, is where the arguments tend to go.
I don't understand how that would be the case, because I mean I can point to there are identity, and I'm not trying to use complicated, like there certain things have identity conditions, so it's going to remain the same object over time if it meets certain conditions. You know, with a table, it has 4 legs in general. You know, there's fuzziness obviously, but the fact remains that as a human being, we literally cannot satisfy any of the identity conditions of anything that is not a human being. That's just straightforward common sense. I don't know of anyone legitimate who's going to argue against that. So I don't know how it's somehow transphobic to say that, or that it entails any kind of transphobia, because at the same time you could recognize that there are socially real features in the world that people are mapping onto and they have assigned great value to the point where they have now internalized that, and that's a legitimate experience for them. At the same time, I reject this notion, as you know, that someone is born a woman at birth or is born a man at birth because of something internal in their brain chemistry. I completely reject that. I do believe it is all environmental conditioning. But that doesn't.
Well, you should then, because that's right now, because we are way past, like, trans shit is like grade 1 on Twitter. No one cares to talk to them. You should talk to some of these people that they're way at this other idea of like anybody can identify as anything. That's essentially where the concept is. Like
they don't want to talk to me.
Well,
based on my experience, they aren't. These people just aren't capable of having these. And maybe that's really mean or whatever, but in my experience, you push back. Like if I just drop the term identity condition, I mean, I don't know.
You should talk to that Dear Lady or whatever. Seems like she is usually open to talking to people. I don't think they'll talk to me anyway, but you should try to get like some of these people on, or not get them on, but like just chat them, because I'm just curious. Yeah, I don't know. Because like I said, like it feels like once you start accepting some of these other identities, one, you've lost the conversation to any person in the middle, right? The average normal person in society doesn't even understand trans people, right? We're like just male and female trans people, okay? And then like on Twitter, the conversation right now is that like, it feels weird because it's literally like I've got people that show up in my DMs arguing like, if you really want to identify as attack a helicopter, like you actually have the right to do so. Like that is unironically what people are saying now. And the conversation is moved so far past whatever, yeah.
But it's because people don't allow for nuance on the issue. Like, what actually do you mean by you can identify? Like, yes, as we said at the top of this conversation, you legitimately can say I identify as an attack helicopter. It just means that when you enter a conversation with someone, your presuppositions of what these words mean are radically different, and you're being incredibly disingenuous by expanding that definition so far as to not meet basically anyone else's. But it is possible that in the future, attack helicopter identification will somehow include not just giant metal vehicles with fucking blades that can fly in the air, but also organic bodies with skin and hair for some fucking reason. I mean, that's not beyond the possibility, but it's still, right now, it's irrational, disingenuous, and you're a poor interlocutor if you want to pretend like these words mean anything like that. That's really what it comes down to, is that it's irrationality and being a poor communicative partner. So, because at the same time, if they are going to say, well, actually, no, I'm not expanding the definition, I actually have the identity conditions of an attack helicopter, then you can just be like, okay, are you made of metal?
Well, but
Do
that
you
the
have
next
blades?
argument they say is literally that like the only restrictions we have are the surgeries that are available to us.
I would then ask them, like, what's wrong with saying the N word then, if, if it all depends on what
So
I want it to
unironically,
mean?
I've seen people argue that in terms of neopronouns, because some people
So can
say
I
that
make
like
my pronouns
yes.
the N word?
Well, I don't know if everybody would be on board with that, but some people say you should be able to create whatever neopronouns you want, and then some people say like, okay, well, what if I want my neopronouns to be slurs? Then I saw people argue, well, slurs have been reclaimed by some people in the past, so if you really want, like, so yeah, that's literally where some of the conversations, yeah.
It makes absolutely no sense. You can't simultaneously say, no, you can't use these words because they have a given meaning in society that cause harm, while also saying at the same time that words can be whatever the fuck you want them to be. You can't hold these two positions at the same time. It's contradictory. And any of those people who are arguing that, I think, are just, arguing in bad faith or just trying to get attention on Twitter. Because I think a lot of the people who make these takes on Twitter are not, they don't, either they don't seriously think about them, or they're just trying to get likes and clicks and trying to become the next Twitch
Yeah, but
streamer who
that's
says
like,
sort of shit.
yeah, that's another thing that's kind of like really fucking with me too. So I've started blocking all of these people. I've actually become a conservative where like if I see pronouns in their bio, I just block them because all of this discourse is like insane. But
Well,
like
I think
when
you on Twitter is not the best, but
sure,
that's
but the
another
trans community on Twitter is also not the best. Okay, it's like I agree that I'm not the best, but that the people listen. The conditions necessitate the type of person you become. All right.
Yeah,
like
I
it's
mean,
gotten to the
so
point to where like the way that some of these people function in these environments. I think that if you were like a normal person or even like a conservative, and you watched how some of these communities function, I think you would walk away feeling reaffirmed of every horrible opinion that like the anti-SJWs in 2015 told you about like trans communities. Like, oh, well, they think you can just identify it. Like, think about it. In 2016, like, well, if you want to identify as a man or woman, tomorrow you're gonna be identifying as an octopus.
So
And
I don't
like,
necessarily disagree with like the gist of what you're saying, but the issue with saying stuff like that is that it's going to be very easily misinterpreted and clipped out of context to essentially say that you think all trans people are like this, when actually it's a very narrow subsection of trans people, just like there's a very narrow subsection of lefties who are
yeah,
crazy
of
fucking
course,
pinkies
the
and
ones
Stalinists,
on Twitter. Yeah.
That's where the rhetoric and being careful about your rhetoric comes into play. And that's why I would not, for example, say like, oh, but that's just you do whatever you fucking want on Twitter. But I agree that there's, I don't even know actually these spaces that you're talking about, because I think I'm also very quick to block people who will comment something that is just completely and patently absurd. I mean, I
Yeah,
assume that they're trolling me mostly, but
the only issue that I have is that it used to be that like the reason why I would make fun of anti-SJ was because they'd be looking at people that have like 2 followers on Twitter or whatever.
yeah,
But
but
like
are there
that
now
dear
people
lady,
with
yeah, that dear lady has like isn't she like 20 or 30,000 followers? And like when she tweets and talks about this shit, she's getting like really big engagement. I wish I could find the last tweet thread that I had, but like one of the big problems that I have is that like here's something I've said so much, and I didn't further elaborate. And I think I've personally poisoned a lot of the discourse. So I think that there are a lot. So this is something that I've had to reaffirm a million times to people. Just because something is a social construct doesn't mean that it's nothing or worthless, right?
Yeah.
You understand that, right?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree.
Yeah. The dear lady gave like some huge like diatribe about how like because I think I mentioned something where it's like, okay, listen,
male and female might be somewhat arbitrary or fuzzy at the edges, and they might be social constructs, but these quote unquote social constructs that are quote unquote arbitrary work for 99% of humanity. Like almost everybody like understands these things and it maps on pretty well. So like there must be some underlying descriptive thing there that we can recognize, even if we want to expand it. But real quick, her counter to this was, well, actually, I've spent a lot of time understanding and deconstructing gender, and I've realized that all of it is arbitrary and pointless. The poles are arbitrary, masculine and feminine, and everything between is all arbitrary and pointless. So I reject all of it.
This is just someone who. It's just, I don't even like that. I don't know.
I think it's silly, yeah, but this type of stuff gets way more engagement today than it used to. Now this is like, I don't want to say it's nowhere near mainstream, but for Twitter, trans topics, it's like borderline mainstream.
It's essentially anti-intellectualism. I mean, that's what I think that is. That's not only anti-intellectualism, but it's anti like common sense. I mean, the things that they're saying, they're trying to think that it means something legitimately like profound, but they're just stating a truism, which is quite literally that, yeah, words can mean whatever we want them to through social development and social communication. Yeah, we develop norms in society. Yes, there is nothing intrinsically about the sound potato that intrinsically, whenever anyone hears that anytime at any space in the world, it's going to map on to what we call potato in the actual world. Obviously. Mm-hmm. That's not profound, but people like try to treat that like that's some profound truth that only they have just discovered. They're essentially constructing this vision that since language is socially constructed, that it's completely devoid of meaning, when actually that is what gives it meaning in the first place.
Yeah.
So they are consciously talking past you in order to make you look bad. That's what's going on, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree. Yeah, it feels like somebody like just opened the box of like, oh my god, socially constructed things. Now everything can mean anything, and anything can be everything, and it feels like really stupid to me. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, but that's true, right? Anything can be anything. It just means you're going to be an asshole when you have a conversation with someone, and you're being irrational and a bad interlocutor. That's all that is, right? Like, yeah, it's like you're purposely entering a conversation knowing that everyone else in the world is using this word differently, and you're just being an asshole and not agreeing on these commonly held definitions that serve absolutely zero use, by the way, because like it's like I said, with the terms man and woman, it's not that the meaning of these terms have changed. It's that the conditions that we understand, we've narrowed them and understood them more concretely, and understand what their actual real meaning is through conversation and experience. But it's very different to then expand and say, well, attack helicopter can mean anything you want. That's just changing the definition. That's adding something on to the definition, which is not at all what's happening in trans discourse when we say that, men and women, or that someone who is assigned at birth as a male can now identify as a woman. That's just a better understanding of the definition as opposed to broadening the definition,
Sure.
And it's just a ton of people, either they're talking past each other, but I think it's more consciously they know what they're doing, and they're just doing it to generate likes and generate followers so that they can get more people to watch their streams. I mean, I think that's what Demon Mama is doing, right? Demon Mama is very deliberately acting like the biggest asshole there is because she's appealing to a viewer base that just laps that up. That I don't actually think Demon Mama is that dumb.
I don't know. It's hard for me sometimes to figure out like who's being a character versus this is another reason why I've stopped engaging with this. I don't know who's being like real anymore, and all of it starts to feel like very silly to me.
Well, yeah, I guess it's possible that she is legitimately that ignorant, but I try to be I'm being charitable by saying that actually she's being a deliberate asshole, I suppose. Well, anyway, the other thing
the problem too is that like when I deal with these types of people, it's like I can't really accuse them of being bad faith because I'm actually being like transphobic by doing so, because I'm like rejecting their identity, because all of these topics get wrapped into transness. This is why, so I'm like the #1 transphobe on Twitch now. I had a friend that was doing a charity stream with like some like local public officials and shit, and like 2 trans people dropped that stream because that person like talked to me. So like it seems like, yeah, and you can say it's because of the inflammatory tweets. No, it's not that. It's not that. It comes from like other clips and other things like that, like the way that I get like every single time I argue with any trans person,
anytime they get any pushback or any hate at all on Twitter, it's all instantaneously 100% ascribed to me. Oh, Destiny's trans hating community is DMing like hate and harassment. Oh, Destiny's transphobic because he doesn't believe that like this and this and this. Like it happens over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean that's I don't believe that legitimately either, but I don't really know what to say about that. That's just
Well, I'm just saying like
political
that's part of
discourse
the
on
general
Twitch and Twitter.
frustration is that it feels like normal people, if you argue when you disagree, that's fine. But when you disagree with these types of people, like you're like a hateful, evil person, which is like
But I think the other thing,
irritating.
it's not only that the content creators themselves feel that, but I think I mean, your audience plays a part because your audience they lap up this shit. They love it when I legitimately think that your community likes when this sort of things happens to you. I think they thrive oftentimes off of essentially your suffering. When people accuse you of doing crazy shit, they know that they're in for a great stream, right? I think that's the
Sometimes,
reality of the
yeah.
situation.
But I don't think like
Well,
my community like drives it. Like usually it'll be like one or two random dipshits on Twitter will DM something mean or bad. They don't even like have any relation to me or my community.
oh no,
But
no,
then
I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the people in your community are actually doing what other people are accusing them of.
mhm.
But I'm saying that it plays a part in that everybody involved, except for you and maybe the other interlocutor, wants to see the drama and wants to see the fight.
Oh, maybe.
I'm not saying that it's the Destiny community that's actually like harassing people and doxing people. No, obviously that's not true because it never is true. If you ask these people for proof, they'll point to one person
Yeah,
who
that's what
maybe
happens every
had,
time.
yeah, that's all bullshit, right? But at the same time, your community loves when that type of drama happens because maybe we're gonna get another manifesto stream. Oh, maybe we're gonna go on a panel and have a big fight. I mean, that's what people love. I mean, that's why I left the space, and that's why I don't stream anymore because that's all like the frustrate. I can't even imagine being having the frustration that you feel like I was doing numbers not even close to you, and I could not fucking handle people because I knew that the people watching me, a lot of the people watching me when I had the high view counts was because I was talking about other streamers and shit talking them. That's what drives the numbers. A lot of the people, I would say the vast majority, are not there because they genuinely care about the truth of what you're saying. They care about the drama and the dynamics that exist between Twitch streamers. It's just entertainment to them,
Yeah, of
right?
course. Yeah.
And I tried to bypass that. I tried to basically say, okay, I'm no longer going to talk about this. But then, your numbers are just not going to be there, and you're not going to legitimately grow. I mean, look at someone like Mimi Root, right? I've seen them streaming, and their numbers are incredibly, incredibly low. Those would be 20 times high with that they had,
hmm
the base that they had at that time. They would have a huge, huge following if they had carried on following what happened after the what is it called? The Austin show,
hmm
whatever. Um, but they chose instead to stick in there, which might be working for them, right? But I mean, it's a shit platform.
hmm
and and it's same with Twitter. They're both really shitty platforms. They're not conducive to genuine discussions about stuff. But, at the same time, I mean, if it's entertainment for people, I mean, I guess that can be fine as long as
hmm
I think the issue is that a lot of people get really easily influenced. I mean, it's especially with someone like, Vosh, who I'm not going to just rant about the
Sure.
entire time. But I mean, you cultivate these these echo chambers and these cults of personality. And I've always respected you because you, at a moment's notice, will just purge your entire community without a care in the world, right? Because you seem to actually legitimately care about the truth of something. I think that at times you can get it exact. In fact, I was way worse at this than you were. Get locked into the emotional. You really hate someone, so you might not be thinking about it as rationally. That happens to everyone, right? But by and by, you are by far, I think, the person who's most committed to seeking out the truth, and that's why I enjoy talking to you instead of like anyone else, because I think most other people are really cancerous on the platform, and
Sure.
that's why I fucking hate panel shows with a passion.
The entertainment
Like,
eye. Do you wanna
oh,
do you wanna talk to perspective philosophy for a few minutes about this, or I
I'm
don't know?
sure, sure. I don't think that they'll disagree.
Not about this thing in particular. Sorry, but they wanted to jump in earlier and
Oh,
talk about this, and
oh yeah, okay, sure.
I'm in a free content mode, so.
I also want to, if you have time, I want to talk about the genocide a little bit. I don't think we're going to disagree on it. Also, fuck the serfs. I mean, I
hmm
I hate that the serfs is the one person. Like they are the person with the biggest following. So I no, I don't know if I should say that because at the same time they've drawn a lot of awareness to the issue, right? They have
Kind of, but it's just
legitimately.
it's got to be the right type of issue. I don't know where you fall on this, but like the reason why I don't like the term genocide, because genocide sounds really intentional, and that's not going to help you solve any problems. Because if you're looking in Canada for people that want to kill all Indigenous peoples that are running these institutions, today in Canada,
Listen,
I don't think you're going to find those people.
but okay, so this and okay, maybe we do have a legitimate disagreement on
Okay.
this, but as someone who is really involved with Indigenous activism and goes to all of these marches, and I'm absolutely on the side of I absolutely recognize with you that genocide under the United Nations Convention on Genocide, right, clearly involves acts of violence, direct violence. But I'm sure you've heard this spiel all before. The original definition, as proposed by Lemkin, was a two-sided coin, one of which involves physical violence and the other which involves cultural violence against, a community. Right? That's what the original definition entailed. And then all of these colonialist countries, including the USSR, who didn't want to be held accountable for Holodomor,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the United States and Belgium and whatever, stripped away that part and included like the intentional clause so as not to have themselves be convicted of
Sure, but
genocide,
like,
right?
sure. So we can argue back and forth over what it is, though. The problem I'm having is that desperately trying to call it a genocide just seems like you're going for some moral grandstanding win, and it doesn't get you any
That's
closer to like
I
actually solving the problems.
so I have to disagree. And
What is
when
it?
I
So like
talk,
here, so when we look at Indigenous issues in Canada today, what
listen,
is the
people have been
difference effectively?
people
Or go ahead.
So if you actually look at the course of indigenous activists, like there have been indigenous activists for years on years, going back to the American Indian movement that started essentially very similar to the Black Panthers, and it expanded, the occupation of Alcatraz,
Hmm.
et cetera. And at this moment, this is the greatest amount of support that indigenous communities have had probably ever right now. And that has coincided with this use of the word genocide. I legitimately believe that expanding the understanding of genocide to include social violence and the forced intervention in social and cultural cohesiveness among a people has actually contributed to gaining recognition and awareness of the state of indigenous peoples
So
in
first of all,
Canada.
yeah. So to be clear, firstly, I would say awareness means nothing, and recognition means nothing unless it's used to power like actual change, right? Which I think we agree with. I'm not to take away that like, oh, it's bad to be recognized, but like if this recognition doesn't actually morph into something, some sort of change, some sort of systemic change, then I don't think it works well. But
But I mean, we're seeing like for the first time in my life where I grew up, I actually like when I was a kid, like I'm young, right? And when I was a kid in the 2000s, early 2010s, I never once heard a single fucking person ever talk about indigenous issues. Seriously, nothing. And then all over Ontario and all over Canada, in the smallest of towns, on Canada Day, everyone I know marched out in orange shirts, orange smoke bombs, occupied the streets, occupied parks. And this was a huge like national moment for Canada and the recognition of Indigenous issues. And I understand this is sort of anecdotal, but I had never seen that before. And we just named our first Indigenous Governor General, for
I
example.
guess like the issue. So here's the issue that I have. Okay, I
I know that's
understand
not
that
a
it can.
policy
I know that
thing,
it
by
can.
the
Yeah,
way,
I know
but
that it can like lead to like the problem is that at this point, then that there's like there's like 20 different genocides going on in like every modern country like in the world. So now it feels like we're almost playing like this treadmill of like this euphemistic treadmill where it's like, okay, well, we have genocide. Well, now we need a worse word for like the real genocide because like arguably under like this definition of genocide, like the U.S. is committing genocide against Black people and Hispanic people, and maybe even still against Indigenous people and against poor people and against women, maybe. Like there's like a million genocides going on all across the Western world if we're gonna like use this term, and
well,
it
I
just
don't I don't know if a lot of those things are necessarily like I your point is well taken. And there is and it's a hard because it's an empirical question we're asking, right? What will be the direct benefits or harms that result from using the word genocide to include cultural genocide instead of just using cultural genocide on its own? That's like impossible to measure, right? And I understand that. But at the same time, I really just don't see the harm in it. And I'm not seeing the harm play out in political spaces in Canada. If anything, I'm seeing awareness and pushes for greater legislation increasing among communities and among political communities. So
I hopefully, as long as it continues to do that, that's fine. Like the biggest issue that I put towards in the United States is like this concept of systemic racism. I think that has been a huge block in terms of getting people to understand what needs to change in different systems.
Yes.
Because when people hear, and fucking everybody thinks this now because the left is fucking stupid and people on the right already think this. When people think that, when people think that systemic racism, that there's a systemically racist thing, they think that means that everybody in that system is racist. So when you say the cops are systemically racist, that means that all the cops are racist.
That's crazier than what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, that's what people think. But the reality is that the system is racist and every single person in that system might actually be not racist, but you'll still have racist outcomes. But because of this misunderstanding of what a systemically racist system is, what an actual system of racism is, or what these things look like, now instead you just get a bunch of people saying things like, well, we need to get rid of racism in the cops. We need to make people less racist. We don't know why these people hate each other. It's like, no. That's not at all what's happening. And when the conversation revolves around like, how do we get pigs to stop hating black people? Well, now you've lost the plot. Now we're never going to do anything to make these situations better because people don't even know what the fucking problem is. And it feels like it's similar to like Canadian, like indigenous people's issues where you've got like people like the Serfs and people that talk about it are acting like Canada is ongoingly today committing genocide against indigenous peoples, abducting kids in the home. It's like, it sounds to me like a really underfunded system that's like not equitably targeting like different people in society. Like it seems like a systemic problem against like certain people.
The issue with they have a political narrative that they want to spin that is like anti-liberal government. And I mean, the liberal government, like, listen, I'm not a fan of the liberal government or of Trudeau or the way that they've approached this stuff. I mean, it is better than the conservative government, sure, but that's a really low bar. Yeah. I mean, for one thing, this is something the federal government needs to be doing, is funding right now investigations into every single residential school across the country, because the federal government is not putting forward any money to support, finding out the truth of what the federal government did to indigenous people at the start and in the middle of the 20th century.
And that is definitely important, but that's just one part of it. But like now today in Canada, you got people running around. How many fucking churches have been burned down now? 2 or 3? How many of these things have happened now as a result of people thinking like, and I have to imagine that hearing that term ongoing genocide probably feels into that quite a bit.
And I'm
sorry, somebody said like 20. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know there's been like a lot of like,
it's been, and so part of the issue with that, and I'm not, absolutely people have done that, but again, these are going to be single actors, of course, and also we can't really give a definitive number because literally Western Canada is on fucking fire. Yeah, so sure. Right. But yeah, there are definitely individual actors who are going out and burning down churches. Right. But to
careful
those people in,
because there are also quote unquote individual actors that on January 6th marched on the U.S. Capitol, or there are individual actors that did like. I do not think these are
individual. Those are thousands upon thousands of people.
Sure, I understand, but when you've got over 20 churches, when you've got like. There is a lot of violence in Canada against like Catholic churches right now. Like, I don't think that you can just say these are individual actors. I think it's pretty clear that you can draw a line from them being spurred on from this concept of ongoing genocide. Like,
so I don't really know. Like, again, these are really complicated, and I'm not trying to be disingenuous. It's a complicated empirical line to draw between those two things.
I agree.
At the same time,
but when we talk about right-leaning issues,
potentially make it harder. But
I understand what you're saying, but like when we talk about right-leaning issues, and this is what I push for, is this because we're going to hold one side to one stand, we have to hold ourselves to the other, okay? People will talk about stochastic terrorism and say shit like PewDiePie caused the fucking January 6th riots, okay? That literally these borderline entertaining people, that PewDiePie will host a meme review with Ben Shapiro that will get people into Jordan Peterson, and when they're doing philosophy, they're going to watch Stefan Molyneux, and then from Stefan Molyneux, they're going to go to other alt-right figures, and now they're radicalized. People will draw that in an instant, but when I look at Canada and I see motherfuckers are burning down Catholic churches while all of Canada is screaming about an ongoing genocide, well, is there really a link there?
Well, I reject the whole, like, that's fucking, and same thing with the Christchurch shooting. Like, obviously, that's all bullshit.
Right? Wait, really? You don't think some of that can play?
It can play a role, but those people individually are not responsible for.
Not individually, but we must recognize that they play into a culture of enabling it, right? Like that everyone. I don't know like PewDiePie in particular, but like they all definitely play their roles. Like, would you say like Lauren Southern was probably? a bit more responsible than like an average nobody for like the Christchurch stuff. Like people that normalize that like great replacement kind of like theory and the idea that white people are being...
Yes. No, yeah, okay, no, I understand. Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. And like I am agreeing with you that the rhetoric of genocide and the role that the left has played in amplifying this type of rhetoric, and a lot of the lies that are being spread around online as well. Like this is the thing I have with the serfs. They actively just propagate misinformation and retweet bullshit stories. Like they'll tweet out, "Oh, look at this water from this reservation." That's a fucking video from Turkey.
Yeah.
And you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? And the idea that the Canadian government can just solve the water crisis in Indigenous communities is so fucking.
Well, but that's
so
exactly my issue.
disingenuous.
It's not disingenuous if you think there's an ongoing genocide. Because if there's an ongoing genocide, it means some fucking asshole in Canada's got his finger on the fuck the Indigenous people's water button up, and we just need to find out who it is. Because that's the issue, as opposed to like, that's why when I say like it's a systemic problems are hard. And Indigenous issues in Canada, not only they're hard, there is no right answer. Because there is a ton of conflict between even individual tribes for what the correct path is forward, right? But when you call it an ongoing genocide, genocides are usually really easy to solve. You just need to fucking stop genociding. Like, that's an easy issue. Like, stop doing it. Stop genociding the people, right?
Part of the issue is that it was not very long ago that people were endorsing, I don't know how much you know about this, we're endorsing Trudeau's white paper, which essentially wanted to abolish the Indian Act and remove all special privileges for Indigenous people in Canada. That is still a really big movement within the liberal political elite, which is essentially to strip out Indigenous people having extraterritorial rights and fishing rights and whatnot, and to essentially make them all completely Canadian. And part of the issue there is that is quite literally cultural genocide, because that would remove absolutely all of their treaty rights that they signed with the Canadian government that are essential to them maintaining their cultural sovereignty and territorial sovereignty, because a lot of these Indigenous groups never ceded their land. I mean, that's the reality. They have signed contracts that are recognized.
I understand what you're saying, but like, this is where things, now I want to be very clear, okay? I'm not presenting a solution because I'm glad I didn't inherit this clusterfuck. I actually think that the American way of doing this was actually way better, where we fucked some people over, but we gave them casinos, and now they generate their own wealth, and they figure out how they want to distribute wealth to their people and shit. I think that's way better than the clusterfucky situation that's going on with Indigenous people in Canada. So the issue that I've been brought up with the Indigenous people's issues in Canada is nobody like, on one end, you might get some Indigenous peoples that are complaining, hey, our water sucks, we don't have access to good education, we don't have access to this or this or this. Like, we're basically missing out on like a lot of like what Canadians have access to. But then on the other hand, there's like this hyper obsession with this, we don't want to be culturally genocided. We want to preserve our culture. So we still want to live in accordance with all of these old traditions, but somehow we also want access to like modern, I guess, like modern access to life. So you run into these weird conundrums where it's like, okay, well, what type of modernization of these people counts as a cultural genocide versus what type of modernization is like, and even the own individual tribes can't seem to agree on what the correct answers are. So when we argued before, remember over the Wet'en, the Wet'en, we're like
Indigenous groups,
yeah.
Willingly, yeah, and again, there is still that complicated issue regarding hereditary chiefs versus the band council system, because the band council system was forcibly put upon Indigenous groups, right? Certain groups resisted that force of, like, the Mohawk have never, right? So that is complicated. I absolutely agree with you that there are certain groups that are absolutely trying to play, both. They'll never be satisfied, right? No matter what happens, they will never be satisfied. Absolutely. And this is the problem with looking at Indigenous issues in Canada as a whole and trying to treat them all as the same. You absolutely have to do it on a case-by-case basis. The Vuntut Gwitchin people of the Yukon Territory are nothing like, the Mohawk in Quebec and in Ontario. They are nothing alike.
I've got a friend, and she's like a teacher from these Indigenous areas, and she talks about how like insanely crazy all of like the contradictions are in her like area. So like she talks to me. So she's a teacher, and she talks about how there's like 6,000 different like Cree dialects, and nobody wants to make like the one Cree language. Nobody wants to do that because you'd be erasing a lot of culture. But you'll get kids that are going to school, and every year the next teacher that they have will be teaching them they'll be correcting them on prior things that they've learned in language. Or she talks about how She talks about
Yeah,
how there's
I've
like this
heard
really big push for like, hey, like we need to get more people in our tribe to engage with education in school, and that's really cool. But they don't really want to send their kids to these areas to get educated, and they don't want to like modernize their school system. So you get this weird push where it's like, we're glad that you're like, we need you to go represent us in mainstream culture, but also don't ever have anything to do with mainstream culture. Where like there just seems to be like so much of like even internal tension in these groups for how you should solve things that I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the specific group because I will say that for a very long time, indigenous generations essentially they became complacent. I mean, they became dejected based on what was like this was right after the residential, an actual genocide, right? And these people essentially had zero power. And it was then the youth movements that now continue that are really driving the push. And that's why it's so vocal and that's why it's so online now, because the people who are really pushing for a lot of this are the indigenous youth. I mean, this is the whole thing. This is something that's basically shared universally across indigenous tribes, which is that the youth have to have a lot of power and you want to pass the power on to the immediate next generation and so on. It's like the reversal of the US political system where all the old fucks are, you know.
Sure.
I mean that's not universally shared, but that's a universally shared custom that the youth have to have power.
Yeah.
And I think that part of it is that again, these are all individually based groups and I don't know specifically about the Cree, but with respect to something like water rights, I don't actually like I'm an Indigenous studies major and I know a ton of and I'm part of that. I don't know a single person who has come to me and actively complains that oh well the government isn't sending us enough money for water. I mean I legitimately have not heard that because the reality is for a lot of these groups they can install water treatment plants at a cost that is 4,000 times more expensive per person than, a settler, right? And then they won't have anyone to fucking man the water treatment facility because there's no training for these individuals. So you have all these really complicated issues. But that's not what indigenous activists right now that I'm familiar with on the ground are pushing for. For example, right now they are very interested in climate change, protecting treaty rights, recognizing the fact of genocide in Canada, which was not taught in schools until extremely recently. Sure. I grew up. I was only 15 when I learned about residential schools.
Well,
that's crazy.
Here's a question that I have for you. Let's say that there was a perfect world where all the indigenous rights were respected and everything, and they got to live exactly as they wanted to. Let's say that their health outcomes and everything were actually dramatically worse than native, like Canadian, or I shouldn't say native, than like people that were Canadian and not like an indigenous people or whatever. Do you think there's an obligation there for Canada or for Canadian citizens to do like cash transfers to people that live like?
This is the thing is that a lot of people construct this vision of indigenous people that they want to go back to living, as they used to in huts and actively live off of hunting. But no. Indigenous people are largely it's an evolving culture. The culture that they're trying to protect is not the culture that they had 100 years ago. By and large, that culture is gone because of genocide. That is the reality. What is now developed is a dynamic culture that has evolved from and interacted with, the type of interactions that they've had with the Canadian government, with their own land, and, with certain elders. So they're not trying to live, they're not trying to live as hunter-gatherer societies. That's not what's happening. And I think that's really a straw man that a lot of people have constructed.
Sure. I'm not saying necessarily, to be clear, I'm not saying that they're going to walk around with fucking spears and loincloths, but they don't necessarily want to be like ultra integrated into ultra modern Canadian society where they're living in like cities with like all of that shit. Like
this is the thing, right? It's the same thing with rural Canadians. A lot of these rural Canadians are this is how a lot of indigenous people want to live. I mean, it's not. Yeah,
but this is the difference is that I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but like in the United States, we just say fuck you, rural people. And I'm guessing in Canada, you probably also say like fuck you, rural people, whatever. But when it comes to indigenous people, it's like, well, these are our special children. We need to take care of them. Whereas in rural America, the accepted thing is basically like, well, hey, listen, you need to move to a city if you want to be successful. Otherwise, fuck you. Like you can't come.
But that's not true. I mean,
so you're telling me that in Canada, there's not a huge push that like students graduate and move to like Toronto or Vancouver or like escape like Alberta or Newfoundland or whatever and go to like BC or Ontario. Like you don't think there's like that same huge push in
No,
Canada?
actually, it's no. There's an influx right now out of these major cities because housing. But
Okay, sure,
that's
maybe, yeah,
my
but that,
point.
but you're,
I take your point. Yes, I
sure.
understand
That
what
even
you're saying.
proves my point. That means that so many people
Yes,
move there that
exactly.
it's like, yeah.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. But it's just like, for example, if you look at pipeline construction in the United States, in Canada, pipeline companies and supported by the Army Corps will legitimately go through reservation or treaty land and specifically avoid very tiny rural towns because it's going to piss off those people, and then they're going to go to the Congress people, and it's going to be a huge big like that's what happened at Standing Rock, right? And that's what also has happened with gas pipelines in BC and in Alberta. I mean, indigenous treaty rights and their spaces are violated so that it doesn't violate rural Canadian spaces. That is a fact. So it isn't the case that they're somehow treated better than rural Canadians. That's just not true. I mean, they are willing to just shove pipelines wherever it is convenient. Less so now because there has been such a great pushback in the past decade. But prior to 2010, people didn't really give a shit, right? And Keystone and everything at Standing Rock, I think, really prompted. I mean, I respect to Biden for doing what he did on Keystone. But there's still other gas link pipelines that are
Yeah,
being constructed. But I reject what you were saying about the idea that they are somehow treated better than rural Canadians. That's just not true.
Can I just add something? Just add a just quick like observation. Do you not think that the word like I don't know if this makes me a little bit weird for saying this. Do you not think that the word indigenous is in and of itself like a bit weird? Like the way that would categorize a group of individuals as being when they interacted with our colonial ancestors. Like, all right, these guys are indigenous, but we're colonials. Like these guys are like native, but we're cultural. I don't know. It just seems like the way that we've distinguished them in the first place is kind of really a historical engagement with like
Well,
a
no,
certain group of
this is
individuals.
self-identification. Most
But even
indigenous
like
people
but like
want
a
to
lot
call
of
themselves indigenous.
Wait,
this
hold
is
on,
the
no.
word.
We're not talking about self-identification. We're talking about the very real distinction that we draw between groups of like indigenous people versus like settlers, right?
I mean,
You can't hold on. You can't self-ID as a First Nations person in Canada and be taken seriously, right? Like that's not. We're talking about like a very real distinction between like historically real ties that people have to lands versus like settler like slash
yeah,
colonial.
sorry. So I'm confused. What is the point you were making? Like, why is
Well,
that
I
weird?
guess like one of the points I'm making is that it seems to me like in a few conversations that I've had with let's say like vegan natives or like indigenous people, they found it hard. Like one of the questions I've got asked a few times is they found it hard to talk to their relatives about wanting to become vegan because let's say like their culture is has been oppressed, has been faced a lot of hardship. And so what they want to do is they want to be vegan, but they don't want to reject their cultural ancestry. And they're like, they ask us, why, how can I talk to, my family about this? And I said, well, if your culture is truly yours, then you have the capacity to change the norms and conventions. You can take them as your own and say, look, I don't want to I don't want to do this, or I want to change this. Much like, for example, the Hindus who moved away from like animal sacrifice and started sacrificing flowers. You can still keep the tradition and the ritual, but you can change the way that it's performed. Now, it seems to me that a lot of people see this as like an attack
Cultural genocide.
on yeah, like as if we're trying to undo that culture when it's in reality like cross-cultural discourse. But it seems like propping up words.
Something real quick because this is along that same vein. Like a broader thing of this is that like when I argue against like white nationalists or whatever, people will kind of talk about this desire to have this unchanging like static culture in some area throughout the rest of human history, and they don't want it to change. They want it to be resistive of all outside forces. And I usually laugh at those people like culture changes all the time. Like you can't like whatever small town or wherever you live, you're never going to hold on to your culture forever. It always changes. That's an accepted thing. And when I argue against white nationalists, that's like obviously that's accepted and that's encouraged and people say that. But when it comes to like people that are American Indians or First Nations Canadians, like what I would describe there as cultural genocide. People would say that.
No. See, this is this idea that there's this thing of calling indigenous groups ethno-nationalists and stuff, which is just go to any indigenous. They don't fucking care. They are more than happy to accept anyone. These are very dynamic groups. They are not static. This is just what I
I don't think
said.
you were saying like ethno-nationalist. I think you were saying more like
Well, no, a lot of
more
people are, but
maybe.
I'm just saying that these groups are are dynamic and are absolutely culturally changing. And I know a lot of vegan indigenous people, and I understand that there's just as there's tension in anything. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
my boyfriend who's Mormon, right? Growing up in a Mormon household, that's an incredibly difficult conversation to have. And if he wanted to stay Mormon, for example, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden he's not Mormon because he thinks that homosexuality should be allowed within the Mormon faith, right? So those are sort of inter conflicts. The one thing that I have said before is that it's always a little, I guess, cringy for me to see vegans. Like, I will just see vegans. There'll be an indigenous person
Wait, how do we get to
online.
vegans?
Pardon?
How do we get to
I
vegans?
used it as I was going to say. I think I used it as an example.
As an example, yeah, I'll just see vegans like just there'll be a random indigenous person and they'll just say, "Oh, you're indigenous, so you must eat meat. Why?" And they'll try to like engage, and that's just incredibly.
Say it the other way around as well, though. I think that's just online discourse is cancer sometimes.
Yeah,
Like people
exactly.
just,
I think
yeah.
but I don't actually see any of those conversations taking place on the ground or among any real, like, serious people. Like, yeah, you should be able to sit down to anybody and discuss the moral ethics of eating animal products. Absolutely. But it's not rhetorically effective to go and prod random people and say, "Hey, why aren't you vegan?" If anything, that's going to
Especially on
turn
like
them off
contentious issues.
more
Yeah,
to the
like yeah.
possibility of being vegan in the future.
Yeah, you're
That
probably
that
right there.
yeah,
But
that's only ever been, like, I agree, indigenous. I think all people should be vegan, right? I believe in veganism.
Where's
That
the line that you draw for those types of like moral statements though? Like if there were First Nations people that were engaged in actual ritual
human
suicide or
absolutely not.
attack or
No,
like homicide or whatever, or sacrifice, we'd
no.
probably discourage that, right? Or would you leave that to
Yeah. But again, if we lived in a society where that was absolutely the norm, you would have to be rhetorically careful
Mhm.
in trying to convert people,
Do
or
you
you're
think
just
that it
going to
might be the
reinforce the
case?
attitude.
Do you think it might be the case right now that indigenous peoples have a greater freedom with what they do with their children versus like Canadian citizens
Well, what do you mean by that
in terms of
specifically?
like choices they make regarding education?
Do you think that indigenous people have greater? No, because of the poverty that a lot of indigenous people live in. I mean, I'm
I
aware of
think it
the
means I
sponsorship.
don't. I was going to say I don't think it means necessarily like, education, as in like quality of
Yeah,
education.
I
I
don't
think it
know.
means
Can you?
like
Yeah.
acceptable norms and conventions.
Yeah.
Oh,
Because I'm guessing
again,
I'll say this with no evidence because I
I,
know this is true. In Canada, I'm sure that you have like a standard by which your citizens must be educated in order to be able to engage with the world and whatnot. And I'm gonna guess that those same standards probably aren't enforced with like First Nations people, right?
um, so again, it's complicated because it depends on the like, for example, most Ontario nations, almost all of their, all the children of that nation do get educated because of where they live. But it becomes more complicated as you go farther north into wilderness, quote unquote, wilderness territories, like people of the Cree Nation or the Gwich'in, or a lot of northern BC communities. Like, it very much depends. But yeah, you're absolutely right that education does remain a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people are really resistant to it
So
because of the
like,
history
yeah,
of
yeah,
education
I
in
understand that. But
Canada.
so then like this is like where my I don't want to say problem because I don't have a strong sense, but this is where I could see a potential problem coming in from, right? Is education is a huge precursor to a lot of other life successes. Becoming educated gives you more money, better access to healthcare, et cetera, right? If you've got groups of people that don't want to engage with your federal or nationwide standards for education, then like, should you have obligations to help them in other ways if they're like resisting that particular thing?
Listen, for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure the numbers are like, um, I think it's something like 70 to 80% of people get a high school education who are indigenous. I'm pretty sure it's like 65 to 80% in that boundary. And I think it's like 50% of indigenous people get a post-secondary qualification. The actual disparity is not as radical, I think, as a lot of people think. I think a lot of people think that only like 15% of people get a
That's quite a
post-secondary
big
degree.
disparity, though. I mean, like if you think about like most of our society,
Yeah,
like
15%. I agree. But when you consider the geographical location of a lot of these individuals, I mean, you'd think would be a lot greater. But
mm,
yeah, I mean, but a lot of these are trade certificates as well. Not all of them are, university diplomas from, like, University of Toronto or Western. But that's changing. I mean, younger people are getting more and more education in Indigenous communities because, yeah, there are sponsorship programs for people in rural or communities that are more remote than, for example, a lot of Ontario nations. But what was the point you're trying to make, Destiny? That there's something inherent to the culture that makes Indigenous children resistant
I'm
because
just
of
saying
conditions
it's
that are
hard if
inherent?
you don't want to engage with like the modernization of a lot of society. If you want to make that choice of your culture, that's fine. But it's hard for me to imagine what a Canadian would feel like if you've got groups of people that don't want to engage with society in a modern way. But
This is
then,
just not true. Like again, this is why I think that that's
Mhm.
just an image that has been painted because Indigenous people do interact with Canadian society by and large. What they do want, this is what Indigenous people always say, is they want inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and worldview in, for example, their
Sure. Okay.
education.
So this is, I don't know if this is true or not. And I fully admit, because I don't live in Canada, right? So I'm just reading off of like, this is like a teacher friend that I have. Okay. At the same time, it's really strange because a lot of people also advocate for more Indigenous people to have masters and PhDs and to be leaders in the modern world. And then they celebrate contemporary artists, Indigenous fashion designers, painters, headers, and things like electro powwow music. But then they want Indigenous schools that are based on land-based teachings, always outdoors. And then when I challenge that and talk to the value of essential reading, writing, and math, then they say that that can be learned off the land too. But that can only be done to a certain degree. It won't fully prepare somebody for university. And then they say, well, maybe we don't want Indigenous people going to university. But then at the same time, they tell me that I should go get my PhD because they need more Indigenous people with PhDs, LOL, and so many contradictions. And then this person, they've got like 10 different stories of like this type of stuff that pops up. Now, this might just be, maybe they have like a fucked experience and maybe this isn't the norm. But like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. But
I mean, I don't really know. Listen, I don't know a single person who advocates for return to that type of education. What I always hear from everybody, and again, might be very different for remote communities.
Mhm.
That's really the emphasis is people who live in remote nations and communities, like somewhere like Black Lake, fucking Saskatchewan
Sure.
or
Oh, okay,
something.
okay. Maybe that could be too. So my Cree example, her sentence was, my
Yeah,
friend
I mean,
works at a Cree
Cree.
immersion school in Saskatoon as a way to try and revitalize Indigenous language, but even that's a total mess because the teachers there are all from different areas of Canada and they all know different dialects of Cree. So they are constantly fighting over the proper way to say something, and then the kids suffer for it because students will learn Cree from one teacher in grade 1, and then the second grade teacher will tell them that what they learned the previous year is all wrong, and then it takes away from the growing and building and knowledge of the language and probably takes away from the learning curriculum too.
Language prescriptivism. That's a sin in itself.
I totally believe that this is my most conservative take. I think that every country should have one language that every citizen should have to speak. That's like the one most conservative opinion that I have on things. But
Well, I think
Well,
that I
I
think
don't know about that, but
I'd probably agree if I'm honest, and I think that's like it's like a reluctant. It's not like necessarily whether you have to speak it, but whether like you can speak it enough to like engage in society and understand like the law. Because if you don't understand the law, then I don't really think you can necessarily be a citizen of any society.
I don't care about understanding in the law. I'm just saying that like I think that in our human experience, I think that we can be open to so many different types of cultures and customs and things, but I don't think that we can overcome language barriers. If you've got like parts of society that you actually can't communicate with, I think that you fundamentally break down. So like the one like big like prescriptive thing I take from language, I think you absolutely need to be able to talk to the people that like live in your society.
yeah, and I
Look
mean,
at
listen, I
Belgium.
don't
Look
know
at Belgium.
any Indigenous person that says that we shouldn't be learning English in schools, that Indigenous people shouldn't learn English. I don't know that. I don't know any people like that. Like these are extreme people that I think you're talking about because like, yeah, I mean, I don't know a
I mean,
single but this might
to
be
be
because of
fair,
where I am, right?
sorry.
But you know, that the idea of that just yeah, would very much surprise me. Like it's again, it's what I said. People want to integrate indigenous learning and worldviews into the curriculum for indigenous students, which seems completely legitimate and
It's
actually
legitimate,
useful for
but you're
me.
necessarily going to be behind everyone else then, right?
I don't think I would agree with that.
You're
I mean,
necessarily, you will, I'm not saying,
context.
it's not a matter of agree or disagree. I'm saying you will necessarily be behind.
This
Unless
doesn't
you're
mean you're
literally,
not teaching math or reading.
yeah, but
I
if you're
mean,
doing
it's
things in addition to it, then that means that
here,
you swapped
no,
out
let
some
me give
part
an
of the modern
example.
curriculum to something else that's like different, right? So you're necessarily going to be behind every other Canadian that's not doing those
Listen, in
things.
Ontario, I had to learn French for 8 years. That was a requirement of my learning. It's had exactly zero fucking use for me because I live in southwestern Ontario. indigenous people would be like, well, why the fuck am I learning French? I'm never going to use French. How about instead I learn my indigenous language
Yeah,
that I
but I
can
don't think
actually
that these
use?
conversations probably aren't over just one language class. It probably has to do with a lot more of the education from
But
the top down, I'm guessing.
I'm just giving you an example of a type of inclusion. But again, they don't want their educational standards to fall so far behind that these people can't, go. But like, look at the rate at which
You could always
indigenous
offer like
children,
after school classes and stuff.
65% have post-secondary degrees, Destiny, already. So I reject this idea that by somehow integrating indigenous knowledge and worldviews, and a lot of the stuff is important. I mean, indigenous people had ideas of environmental protection far before any type of Western
I think that's
knowledge of
overstated
ecology.
though sometimes, I
I
think that
don't
it, like
think it's overstated.
you see, I don't know, maybe it's just because of like my knowledge of history is so, especially on like various indigenous populations, and I know that it definitely changes depending on the population in
Listen,
question. um
listen,
so
when,
like
for
depending
example,
on the
can I
nation, like it's just because depending on the nation we're talking about, right, they're gonna have different positions on these on like environmentalism and sustainability and the consideration of the land, and some of them will be like spiritual in origin, some of them will be scientific in origin, and I think that like the dialectical end of each one of those positions will have a different outcome. Kind of like how you could get Christians who, for example, if they take the spiritual take of the dominion of man over nature, they could take that literally as dominion, as in like control, and we can do what the fuck we want, and use that as a, building off people like Francis Bacon, bastardizing them and using that to some conservative agenda. Or you get people who turn it into an environmentalist take. Look, we're supposed to be guardians. What the fuck are we doing? We're destroying the earth. Like, so like, like saying that it will like necessarily lead to better environmental outcomes, I think is
No, but as an example, indigenous people who actually live on the land in areas that are suffering from climate change, these are often people who are consulted in scientific studies about like these people see the results of climate change far before any type of scientific or geological investigation. I mean, if you look at the Arctic Wildlife National Refuge, indigenous people were the first people to report the effects of this. And this is because part of their culture and part of the way that they live and the knowledge they have is they can immediately see the effects that it have on the porcupine caribou herd, on the type of vegetation that inhabits along the river.
I
I mean,
imagine it's anyone like so if you're like you're an indigenous, like not just indigenous populations, but if you're like let's say you are in Indonesia or whatever, and you're in like a floodplain or a delta,
of
you're going to
course,
see a
yeah.
change in the seasons and like the way that the way
Right.
that the floodings work, and you have, yeah, you're definitely more in contact with it.
Right, and so that's a valuable thing that they want to incorporate into their educational standards in that area. That doesn't mean that that extends somehow to a bunch of people who,
100%.
live in
That's just a
Windsor,
different
Ontario.
photography, isn't it? Like I think that if anything, what we need to do then is really, as a field, incorporate that knowledge into
Right,
our
but
into our
that
discourse.
exactly, but that's exactly what the indigenous people that I speak to are talking about is integration. Like I think a lot of people imagine that everyone's going to be taught, be taught like Nanabozo stories about someone who fell from the heavens and landed on Earth. I mean, this is stuff that gets taught in history courses and religious courses all across Canada, except they learn about the Bible, right? So the idea of incorporating traditional stories of that carry with them ethical teachings for a given
You, you
community
you
is
know
also
I'm
not something
more
I'm
for that. You
objecting to.
know that I'm all for that. I'm a more realist man. I believe in narrative theory. I'm all
Right.
about that. McIntyre talks about like the myths in terms of like Camelot and stuff like that. Like it's not like I'm not like even all about that. I think it's very, but I think it's valuable. I think it's like invaluable actually. I think like the amount of information you can get off a story that's so for example, I think I've probably learned more off Bible parables in terms of ethics than I did off like in terms of my childhood than I did off like most of my interactions like with other kids and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so that's all we're talking about is that type of integration. I think people are viewing it like we throw out the science curriculum or something. No, it's about integration in a way that is productive for society as a whole, I believe, in the way that I stated, but especially for retaining that type of cultural unity that has been previously forcibly destroyed by the Canadian government through the residential school system, through the 60 scoop, etc. So it's
My
not as
fear is that it's
crazy
already
as
been destroyed, like that's my genuine fear that it's like that the idea of that like so for example that's why I brought up the whole the whole like issue with people like associating with like it being indigenous, and it seems like or like it's almost like I worry that it could become reactionary, that our culture is whatever your culture isn't, kind of bad faith in that, because there's so like sometimes there is like something to go off, but in some like especially Native American, from what I'm aware, communities, like that communities, what like that culture was nearly annihilated, like whether it was indoctrinated out of their children, or like their parents were like absolutely like actually massacred, like so in terms of like cultural indoctrination and cultural authenticity, like what I fear is that it becomes an inauthentic identity and a way to associate yourself with like a past identity which you don't actually
That's
own,
just that. But no, I mean, I completely reject that. I mean, absolutely, for certain indigenous groups, yeah, their culture has literally been destroyed. But no, there is very clear cultural continuity, like very powerful like for example, the Vuntagwitchin people. I mean, their culture has not, they have not had any type of the disintegration that you're talking
I think
about.
Canada had it better than the US as
Oh,
well.
yes, far, yeah, exactly, far better. So I can't really speak to, Native American lived experiences and cultural destruction. I really can't. I can only
And
speak from the
Australia's.
limited knowledge because I haven't been to all of these nations. I have limited contact with what I've learned in school with indigenous people that I know. So I don't want people to think like I'm talking for all of Canada. There are obviously going to be very clear cases that go against every single thing that I've said here because of how diverse indigenous communities are in
Yeah,
Canada.
that's a really great point, man. I think that's exactly it. And I think like we found this same, like, although it's not exactly related, we found the same issue with like this. We started calling minority groups in the UK like BAME, like Black Asian Minority Ethnicity. I think ethnic. And it seems to be counterproductive, because when we do just lump everyone who's not white into a category, it's almost as if we lose all of the nuance, like as if like all of the individual characteristics of that community were dependent upon features which are, not determined by their lack of white, like what lack of whiteness or something.
Yeah, so I'm like, Desi, do you disagree with any of this?
I was reading something totally different. What
Oh.
summarizes for me? Sorry, what?
I mean, essentially, it's about integration of indigenous worldviews into the education system that doesn't replace, like, you're still going to
Oh,
learn
no, no, no,
math
no.
and
I
science.
disagree. I think that there is
Oh,
fundamentally, I think there is an epistemic difference between these people understand the land, so we should seek to learn from this particular thing and incorporate that into our scientific frameworks to have a better understanding of the land. Versus, because I think that drive is different than, oh my God, we need to preserve native cultures and whatever possible. Let's find out how way they can, like, how can you contribute to modern culture? Oh, look, there's that thing. Okay, well, let's use that. I think that,
no, no,
like,
no, but that was one example I gave, but the inclusion of indigenous narrative and story in the same way that we're taught narratives right now in school, like integration of indigenous stories. Like I have to learn fucking Catcher in the Rye, right? Catcher in the Rye is not going to speak as powerfully, to someone in an indigenous remote community as a story from their own culture. That's the type of inclusion that we're talking about, because that's not included in the educational standards province by province. So the idea is that
Sure.
you can then incorporate those teachings that actually relate to them, and that by
He
which
has a
is it
spicy
also
one.
has the benefit of preserving their culture.
He has a spicy one though. If we agree that all of these narratives, or like a lot of these narratives, are like ethical in origin, like they have some sort of like moral, like to teach the individuals in order how
Yeah,
to
they
better their lives.
absolutely do.
Yeah.
Indigenous stories are
Then what
should not be
happens when the
taken literally,
morals?
usually.
Well, what happens when the morals conflict with the meta culture of that society? So
They
let's say,
almost
like,
never don't. I
I'm not saying that
honestly
they do,
can't
but
think of
let's
a
say,
single
let's
example.
take for example, like in the UK, there's like, for example, if you go to the doctor's office in the UK, there'll be a sign saying about female genital mutilation. I mean, this is a very, very niche thing, right? Like, and I will say, it's nothing to do with indigenous people, so like, no
mhm.
one take that. But like, female genital mutilation from like certain like African cultures still like engage in it. And obviously, it's horrific. I mean, like it's literally mutilating female anatomy just because that, like, they're born female, right? Um, we would consider that misogynistic, wrong, absolutely disgusting. If we find people doing it, that is like a criminal offense in the UK.
Well, this is
Now, if
Destiny
they,
and I were talking about this earlier when he brought up what if indigenous communities were still participating in human sacrifice. Obviously, yeah, we do have a moral duty to then step in and say, no, you cannot be doing that in the same way. And that we actually have the power. Like, I don't consider that imperialism, right? I mean, it is imperialism in the weak sense, but the overall benefits of doing that seek to protect the autonomy of
Ooh, but
individuals.
here's
For
the
the
thing.
same
Do you think it would
reason,
work? So like I think Hegel makes the point where you can't force moral progress. So he's like, it's just gonna keep happening. The only thing that's stopping it is you.
well, no, I mean,
And if
of course it's going to
anything,
work because if you look at the history, we radically changed the ethics of indigenous society by, basically forcing them to change.
yeah, but it's like, well, like I don't know, man, because you like look at like take for example Iran or something like that. Like their reaction to what was like arguably moral progress in terms of like the westernization of like quote unquote of how they treat women, and educating women and so on like that, was met with like radical like theocratic like resistance. Like the
Like, I
people
know
of
you
the area.
have a view of history that's rooted in Hegel, but I mean, I
Well,
don't
like
find
I
that
mean, like, yeah, I mean,
compelling.
it's just one area. I mean, like how every area reacts to a given narrative is going to be different, right? Like
Yeah.
depending on like the how well it's accepted and how well it like culturally, like it's really about whether the population accept it. It's whether if a population rejects it, whether they can either become non-resistant and accept the doctrine, or they can become like something like Iran, where it's like the idea, or many countries, to be honest, around the world. I mean, the West, for example, is just almost a catch-all like problem, like in terms of certain countries. You just it's West and it's wrong. And then like it's the same thing. You get people over here that are just as narrow-minded, where they'll just say like, oh right, if it's Muslim, it's bad. And it's ridiculous, but it's a way of like bad faith people approach problems bad faith, and like and cultures when they're placed on under imperialist strain can become reactionary.
Listen, I'm more than willing to discuss this with you, but I think it's a little bit too niche, off
True.
topic.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I agree. I
yeah,
agree.
we can
I
discuss
came
this
on. I
later.
came on to
But,
talk. I didn't even want to talk about trans issues.
yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you about. Do you think you can identify as an attack helicopter?
No, but do you think that you can identify as trans race, like
Yes.
transracial?
Yeah, I
I think
actually
so
do believe
too.
in that.
I think so
I
too.
think that some of the concepts could work. But I don't agree with borrowing the language from trans people because I don't think that it maps on one to one. That's my issue. Like,
See,
if somebody, like, because as soon as somebody starts talking about quote unquote transracialism, like, oh, well, maybe there's like a culture or something you identify with, and you don't necessarily look like those people. Yeah, sure, that's all valid. But it's not transracial because, like, that concept of like what a gender identity is so much more internalized, I think,
Yes,
than
yes.
like you're like the clothes you wear, the music you listen to, like or their culture, or whatever. I think
No,
I just
yeah,
don't
I
like the
totally.
borrowing of the language from that.
I mean,
maybe
the fundamental issue, the fundamental impasse that exists is that it is going to be very difficult. So here's the no, I don't know. It's complicated because the biggest disanalogy for me lies from the fact that, I was assigned male at birth. I now identify as non-binary. But let's say that I wanted to transition to become a woman. It becomes complicated in the fact that if like well, for example, I identify as non-binary. Everyone identifies me as a man because I have facial hair. That is just a distinguishing characteristic that people assign to being a man. And if I don't shave it, I will always be considered a man to basically anyone I talk to, even trans people, even other non-binary people. And it really pisses me off. But that's just something I have to deal with. And I mean, likewise, if I am white skinned, very, very fair skinned, but I then want to identify as black, that is an incredibly difficult thing to do and to be accepted within society. But obviously, it's much harder to do that under a racial lens and under a gender lens, where you can very easily be accepted into society because you're participating in the type of presentation that people associated with being a woman or being with a man, right?
what
So that's the biggest hurdle.
here's the thing though, like one, like like with non-binary and gender. I like gender non-conforming. I really do like that, like as a term, because it feels like it is in and of itself showing like the political drive and force behind the words, you know? Like when you're saying like non-binary, it's like you're kind
But
of saying like, look, this binary distinction.
I have no political force behind
But I think
identifying
this
as
is,
non-binary.
I think like if Foucault's right, you know, and like in many ways,
Well, I don't think
like
Foucault
we're
is
just
right. So
not in every way, not in every way. Don't get me wrong. I don't get me wrong. I don't agree with these like metaphysics or anything, but I think that he's right in when he says like power is everywhere. And I think that the reality of the situation is that when we engage in certain norms and behaviors, we constantly monitor each other's like behaviors and conventions and impose, you know, sort of rules upon each other without even realizing it, like implicitly, just by looking at each other. When we've been raised in an environment, do we expect the eyes of the other to like you know, point out our mistakes or you know, give us validation or for our like authenticity, you know, which is the whole point of
I
trying
don't
to
want my
identify in the first
gender
place.
identity to be part of to be seen
But
as any sort of political statement. It's not. I just don't.
no, but it's more of like it's an implicit like, so for example, like it's like, so if like if you're a man or you're a woman, it's exactly the same. It's not to say that it's like, even if you accept any given like you know, political, like, you know, the norm or convention, you are endorsing it to some degree. If you reject it in any way, then you are, you know, you know, creating a new norm. You are
This just seems
differentiating.
vacuous, though. I mean, yeah,
I don't
it's a
think so.
true. It is a truism that by participating in a ton of shit, I am in a sense reinforcing a political system of power. By literally going to Walmart, I am making a political action by reinforcing the capitalistic framework and consumerism. I mean, sure, but I don't entirely see how that's
Yeah,
relevant,
but I
really.
mean, it's very relevant when you start saying that, like, look, like, what were classically identifiable features within our society with given like behavioral conditions are no longer those identifiable features. Like the idea of having a beard is no longer masculine. So, like, you are changing what would be some of the fundamental like precepts in terms of like, you know, what people would expect from you behaviorally.
Yeah,
It
but
is
where's
political
the
and politically
ethical
radical.
but where's the ethical ought
And
in doing
well,
that?
oh
I
no,
don't feel any
well,
ethical.
yeah, I would probably, just because it's political doesn't necessarily mean that it's like, so for example, you can have like political changes that aren't necessarily like ethically
Well,
bounded. I
right,
mean, like you can have
but
aesthetic norms and conventions.
clearly we're talking about what we should be doing and whether transracialism is an ethical thing to do. Whether not only if
Well,
it's an
the
ethical thing
only
to do,
thing
but
that I
whether it
would,
is metaphysically possible.
well, I think if we talk about ethics of it all, I think that in terms of any of these identities, it has to be in relation to a form of equipment, right? Like the identity itself is really for the authenticity of individuals and society. Like, is it good for the individual? Is it good for society? That's what we really need to be considering. So, for example, are we helping trans people when we help them transition, or are we helping trans people, you know, if we stop them from transitioning, or if we give them therapy? Like, how do we approach these issues is of ethical relevance. To trans people and to society. I think trans people, especially because I think they're really the ones suffering. I mean, if you look at the suicide rates involved with trans people, and that's to do with how they're accepted in society, that's a, you know, we need to be, you know, for example, I think we would both agree, and I think everyone in the, you know, I think Destiny would probably agree, like, no one should be fucking hurting people, you know, just because they're trans. And you
Well,
know that.
we have to define hurt. What it depends on what you mean by that, right?
I mean, like you know, like committing physical harm
Yeah,
or,
committing fit. Yeah,
you
but
know,
because some people will argue that like not recognizing a certain identity is a form of harm. That's the only
well,
reason why I want to clarify that. Yeah, sorry.
this is, you know, that you're absolutely right, and I think this is where it gets really contentious
Well, I
because
mean, I
people
think
like,
that's true though.
Well, but then hold on.
well,
But then that means if I identify as a helicopter and you don't call me like an
Well, certain
F-80
forms of
Killbird.
identity.
Well, yeah,
well, you
exactly.
said
That's
it
what I'm
wasn't
saying, right?
political. You said it wasn't political a second ago, and you said that your identity is not necessarily a political assertion. Now, yours mightn't be, but if you're trans, then it has to be a political assertion
No,
because
but
you're a
this is what
certain.
I said. It was a truism. I mean, it's a truism that almost every act that I take is inherently political in that it has an effect on the power structure, however small it might be. But I'm saying that when I do it, I myself am not consciously having to participate in that, nor is there a political obligation that I have to participate in that movement in virtue of identifying as non-binary. That's the point I was making. It's obviously a
Unless it
truism.
was sorry,
Yeah,
go for it.
I mean, it is obviously a truism that identifying as anything is going to, have a role in, the power structures that exist within a given society. I'm only just saying that I I see a lot of people saying this, that, if you identify as non-binary, you have to be a participant in, certain types of political movements, or that you are necessarily a part of a political movement, when I think that's a very distinct point from the one you're making, which to me
Oh
just
yeah,
seems like
yeah.
a truism.
I mean, like the point I'm making is like, like more very like postmodern. Like
No, I know, but I also think a lot of postmodern stuff is like, it's true. It's just very vacuous and isn't relevant to a lot of conversations.
Well,
And
I
I
think
think
this
that
is very,
here
I
is the
mean,
more
like, this
important
is
part.
incredibly relevant. I think this is incredibly relevant just because, like, when we start looking at, like, these norms and conventions to be malleable and to be, like, shapeable, when we start talking about whether an individual can move and become, like, a different signifier, what we need to ask ourselves is, okay, let's assume we can broaden these definitions. Let's assume that we can allow for this to take place, or we do it. And I think the postmodernists would say, like, look, why are you talking about ought? But obviously, you and me, both moral realists, right? So we're going to look towards what would be the semantic content, and like necessarily. Actually, I don't know. Do you actually think there's anything tied to gender in terms of the
Th-
semantic content?
Yeah,
Like,
of
is there
course,
anything
there's something semantically real
Okay,
that
cool.
is inherently being mapped onto. Whether or not the person who identifies is actually mapping themselves onto that content is a different question. Like, this is what I was discussing with Destiny is, yes, there are obviously people who see the semantic meaning in something like woman, and they identify with that meaning. But I don't think that stops people from being able to identify as woman, even if they are not consciously identifying themselves with that semantic content.
Well, you see, I think that you're not like. So here's the thing. I think that what it means to be a woman is not just the performance, but the like. So, for example, if someone goes on a stage and they're just performing, as a female, like as well, not a female, but as a woman, the look the part, the act the part, but they are literally just playing a role. They are not a woman. What makes a woman is not just the performance, but the internal acceptance of the performance as an expression of their own subjectivity.
Yeah, no, I just completely disagree. I don't, because
Wait,
that to me
how?
is just sort of, I mean, I think that's inherently essentialist in a certain sense of the word. I mean, I don't think you need to
How?
necessarily, well, because this is what I was saying to you, Destiny, is I don't really understand what it means to be a man. I don't really understand what it means to be a woman. I don't really even know what it means to be non-binary, but I just call
Well, this
myself
is,
that
I
because
think this was the type
pragmatically it's
of,
useful for
yeah,
me.
this is why I was trying to draw lines around this conversation of why I thought that, like, if people want to self-ID as other things, like, that, okay, that's weird. But I consider gender to be relatively unique because it seems like we have an internal experience of that there seems to be some real underlying content such that there's a fundamental difference between somebody. I'm really uncomfortable saying pretending to be a woman because it sounds like I'm talking about all trans people. That's like a huge, like, turfy talking point. But, like, the performance of being a woman is a lot different than, like, the internal experience of being a woman.
Like Jared Leto or something in Dallas Buyers Club, like pretending to be trans. Like he wasn't trans. Like the
Yeah.
separation between him playing trans and being trans is significant. And
For example,
unless we can
okay,
identify that, like it becomes vacuous. To say that
then am
he was
I?
trans for that role.
Well, so what would I then be in the fact that I don't consciously do anything to present as anything? I
Well, that would
never
be
make.
non-binary. Like the idea is like you're not engaged in the binary distinction. That would be the whole point, right? You're not conforming to the gender binary.
So is non-binary purely defined in terms of a negation of the binary?
Well, isn't
I
that,
would probably
wait,
I
isn't
say
guess
that,
so.
that's
Yeah.
true. I guess
that's
it is called
tautologically true, right?
non-binary.
It's literally called non-binary, right? Yeah,
Yeah, I
you're
guess that's
describing yourself
true.
as the
Yeah.
antithesis of.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, then I don't know if I'd necessarily disagree. It would just mean that if someone, yeah, but okay, so
I
but
guess,
let's
wait,
say
real
that
quick.
we
So to be
have.
clear on the prior discussion, it feels like some of the arguments that people were making, though, was that okay, I'm actually really glad that, I'm glad I dragged perspective philosophy in. Okay, the way that you explain something seems to hit on the big point. Okay, so you talk about there being a difference between being something versus the performance of something. So my issue with Demon Mama's stance is that she made it sound like you could self-ID as anything. It feels like from that logically
Regardless of
follows that
performance.
everything is a performance and there is no being.
Yeah, but I agree that everything is performance, but you can't perform as a deer.
But the problem I have there is
why
when I look
not?
at
That's the
fuck deers. Okay, the problem that I have there is that, like, trans people are performing so well they kill themselves.
Do you understand how strange that sounds? Like, and maybe that's not maybe that's an unfair argument, but that's essentially what we're saying here, right? We're saying that like there is a performance or there is like some social, whatever presentation, and some people are so committed to that they are driven to suicide. It feels like there's something more there. There's like an internal, like actual fact of the matter, not just a social performance of something.
I'm not rejecting the possibility of that, only saying that might not be the case for everybody. Like,
I don't know, man. I definitely think that there has to be some sort of like, look at it like this. When we look like, I think if you take like a psychoanalytic take from this, like,
okay, well,
sorry.
Can we take a different take on it?
No, I love psychoanalysis. But it's more of like philosophical, like analysis of the psyche, right? So if we take, for example, how an individual may identify, if we take like the Lacanian position that the psyche, like in a Freudian sense, is built from like something like imagination, the imagination, and the signification. If we look at the world around us and like objects, then like imagination is really just whatever like we can, like any imagery which we can
try to translate this into something that doesn't use Lacanian terminology.
Yeah, I'll definitely try.
Make this like a normal person and just say the concepts. Yeah, go.
Okay. So when I look at like something like a chair, I can call it whatever I want. Like the word I use can be whatever I want. Like, I can say chair, table, whatever. But the semantic content, the meaning, is something else. Now, obviously, we would all agree. I think that language is a game
part of it.
Played.
It's part of it. Oh, are you Wittgensteinian about language?
I agree with Wittgenstein, in terms of how it works.
Okay, well,
I agree with Brandom about how
even worse.
Yeah, you see, I would say that the inference that a chair, like what a chair is, the meaning behind it applies a fittingness, quote unquote, of the concept. So like when I'm actually trying to engage with the chair, I'm trying to use an idea with another party in order to fulfill a certain goal between us. So we would agree that a chair is for sitting because of the way in which we would structure like language so that we can use it for a certain end, and that requires an engagement with reality.
I don't. It'll be a whole complicated conversation, but Brandom's views in the philosophy of language.
Don't go off into this. Just engage, I think, with this idea rather than tagging an entire school. Is there a disagreement of like that?
He's making a foundational perspective on how meaning is gained, and this is the conversation of the philosophy of language. That's what it is about.
Sure, but like, so what in terms of what he just said, that two people will agree upon some term or concept, but ultimately, as they have a conversation about it, that concept has to have some semantic content, something that maps onto the real world, or is an engagement with some external real world. What part of that is disagreeable? If I've understood that.
No, I agree with that. But what I disagree with is the idea that it's something like, it sounds to me like you think it's all purely internal perspective philosophy, or something that is divorced. Like there's no reference, is not playing a part, essentially.
Oh no. Like I mean, like so. For example, like signification is incredibly important, and I think that like in terms of how language functions, like meaning itself is developmental, like hermeneutic. So like what we actually mean can develop. And we can learn that what we mean when we speak is something separate to what we thought we meant. Like, like in a kind of psychoanalytic take. So like when like people divulge that they have knowledge of themselves that they don't realize they have, which is like the whole point of like psychoanalysis and stuff. So for example, like if I constantly talk about like if I'm describing me dreams and I keep using the word like, oh yeah, so like I just had these feelings of like being trapped, or like I felt enclosed, and I used words that kind of are synonyms for the same concepts, but I don't realize I'm using them and stuff like that.
I do disagree with this, because I find the fact that we can participate in what's a good example, the fact that we can participate in something like what is the name for it? Malapropisms. Is that how you say that? It's essentially where you misspeak a word, but you're still able to, like, what's a good example of this? He's the very pineapple of politeness was the one that I was always taught, which is really, is the pinnacle of politeness, right? But the word that I'm using is still understood because of the norms that we have within society. So you're trying to tie something and this is where I think I actually am more internalist than you, because it seems like you're saying that when I use a certain word, that it can be meaning something completely different, completely divorced from the way that I consciously used it at a given time. I think that when we engage in a conversation with one another, we come with our presuppositions of what words mean, and to have any sort of conversation and to arrive at any sort of meaning, there has to be an agreement upon those presuppositions. I don't
Well,
think that
I would say that like both happen simultaneously. I think that you can mean something without realizing that you meant like that was meaningful to you in a different way. Like you can discover like the depths of your meaning, and that I think that's like like poetry or something. Like you can read poetry once, but then or twice, but then maybe something happens in your life, and you're like, oh my god, like I actually finally understand that poem. Like it's not to say that like the words have changed and that you didn't understand them to begin with. It's that something about you has changed when you've read the poem.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree. Like
Okay, real quick.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I got 4 minutes because I got another big thing going on. But go ahead.
Okay, sure. I mean, what speakers share within a given conversation, I don't think is necessarily learned in the way that you're describing, and I don't think it's inherently governed by, a set of rules and conventions that are known to both speakers in advance of it. Because like I don't view language in the way that you're seeing it. We arrive at a language with essentially a presupposition of the meaning of a word itself, and then that can be corrected through linguistic practice. There's no other
I don't disagree with that
hierarchical
necessarily.
meaning.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
but
don't
you're
necessarily disagree.
attaching something higher
I
to the
would
meaning than
the
just that
high.
presupposition.
Well, I would say the foundation to the meaning is the fact that we're using it as equipment. It's like a pragmatic goal in which, when we're engaging with each other, fundamentally there's a normativity which is guiding our capacity to actually achieve our goal. We'll realize that, wait a minute, the way in which I'm using this word isn't actually making me achieve the goal any more or less. Which is why, like in trans issues and so on, like in terms of identity, if the identifying more or less with a certain gender or certain performance wasn't actually allowing you to feel more authentic, people then detransition. The issue mightn't have had anything to do with the gender performance, but more to do with another psychoanalytic issue, which is what with the importance of therapy in these cases and the importance of engaging with identity in a meaningful way, so that people can take the actions which are best suited to them. Sometimes it's transitioning, sometimes it's not. It just depends upon what the internal state of the individual.
Yeah. Okay. So when someone, for example, identifies as a woman, but is not per participating in the performative aspects of being a woman ever, I don't think that precludes them from saying that they are a woman, though, because
I
their
would say that they wouldn't
understanding,
understand what it was.
I don't know if I necessarily agree, because if we look at the development of our understandings of gender or even of sex as a whole, these are ongoing historical changes. Like you're basically
But
saying
they've
that there
always
could
had
be no
logical connections with one another.
but you're
So
saying
like
there
they've
can
always
be no
built on.
conscious drive by a specific
Oh no,
individual to have a
no,
refinement on the meaning of a
I
word.
completely disagree. I absolutely think that a lot of this is conscious, and I think that consciousness plays a huge role. I think that like don't get like if I didn't believe consciousness played a huge role, there'd be no point in psychoanalysis because there'd
Then
be no
what
point
stops
in
someone
analyzing.
identifying as a woman who isn't performing in the conventional sense? You're saying
Because
that
I
that's
think
not possible and they're not
it's not to say
understanding
that
it.
it's
What
not
if they're
necessarily.
trying to expand it
I'm
or
not saying that
redefine
they.
it?
Well, I'm not saying that they couldn't expand or redefine it, but I would say to expand or redefine it, in the words of Aristotle, like in terms of knowledge, we need to go from what is known to what is knowable. There has to be a logical connection between each premise in which the word is actually like developing through. So like in terms of its use, it needs to be comparable and understood in terms of at least some form of function as the word prior. If it's not, then it is not this. It's not performing the same action as the word that it's developing from.
So it doesn't have to encompass all. So that there's not a list of
All
essential
no,
aspects of it.
but
There just has to be a transitive connection between the
yes, there just
usages
has
over
to.
time.
And but the reality is that connection has to be normative so that individuals can actually
Right, but it's not
understand and
necessary.
develop it.
Crucially, it's not necessary. It is contingent, but it develops over time. And
What
when I participate in it, I have to be participating in at least one aspect of the
some
conditions
of the
of that.
connections would be
Okay.
necessary in terms of like the function of the word though. So
Well,
like for
okay,
it to be
fair.
gender,
Yes.
for example, like
Yeah, it has to be a human being, right? Or well, I that would apply probably to gender, not to sex. Yes, okay, I understand. I think I mostly agree with you. Um, but okay, but I don't think that this really goes against what I was saying earlier. I mean, so you're basically saying that
I'm not
someone who
arguing
says I'm
against
a man
it.
and then refuses to perform in anything related to manhood is thereby not a man. That's what you're saying.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there could be radically trying to reconceptualize, but at the same time, unless they contain some sort of like semantic connection, like as in like the content of of that meaning needs to contain some sort of normative connection to the content of what man
Okay.
typically
Yes,
means.
yes. But they're not wrong necessarily. They are just being a poor, this is what I was saying to Destiny. They're being a poor communicative partner because they are presupposing a meaning that doesn't at all map on with the meaning that other people are using.
Is there a
Well,
difference between?
maybe.
I'm just real quick because I'm just curious because we're in the weeds on this, but you guys can go back to the weeds. But like for Rem, let's say that somebody is pretending to be a woman, and then somebody quote unquote is a woman. Is there a difference between those two things? And then what is the difference?
Yes, there is a difference. The difference lies in the fact that one person is intrinsically or sees it as, I suppose, an essential part of themselves, while another person merely performs in it for I think it has to do with the reasons by which someone is doing it. And I suppose that would be a psychological state that somebody's in. But I can easily imagine calling myself a woman, presenting as a woman, acting in feminine ways that people identify with womanhood. And I think it's still legitimate to call myself a woman. I'm still identifying as a woman, but I might
I
not
would
have the
say that we would
psychological
have to call you a
tie.
woman.
Pardon?
I would say we would have to call you a woman because we wouldn't have access to your internal state. But I think you would realize that you are being bad faith calling yourself a woman. It would be like if you were
Oh
like,
God, hold
like,
on, just
imagine-
real quick. This is all hypothetical, and this is not like of trans women in general. Just to be clear, because this conversation sounds
Oh,
really
no,
conservative.
absolutely
I know.
not.
I'm just saying that just
These
for the
are
clear.
radical
No.
situations.
I know. I'm
that
just
I've never
saying to be
seen.
very clear.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
yes,
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
understand.
No, thank you. I do like to be rescued
Jesus
from like,
Christ,
you know,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, like I mean, hypothetically, like if someone was like, let's say, let's say like saying it for like I don't know, like some sort of either like social gain or let's say like even like they were doing it as a just a performance just to see like it was like a conservative or something like under some sort of deep cover, you know. I don't know, whatever like hypothetically you want to give it. Like I would say that an individual acting in that way, you know, for an end which was separate to the function of their own authenticity would be bad faith. They are trying to attempt to achieve a goal which is not the expression of their gender identity or the expression of their subjectivity, but
I would
instead
ask,
something else.
what is that essential state that this is my issues. What, and this is part of the issue that I'm talking, this is why I'm non-binary. I literally can't point to what you're describing. I don't know what
I
the
would say
fuck you're talking about.
it's an at home feeling. That's what I would just say. Really, at the most part, it's feeling
So
at home in the world.
it's not a scientific entity, obviously. It's a type
It would
of
be an
mental
ethical one.
state.
It would be an ethical one. It would be like whether the individual's subjectivity is being recognized in a way which allows them to
And is
see
there
themselves
degrees
within the world.
of there's degrees of commitment to this at
Well, you say
homeness?
I don't. This doesn't feel like a degrees of commitment thing to me. This feels like a binary thing. Like,
Well, this is why I don't think it can be ethical then.
well, no.
Because I
So,
don't
wait,
know
here,
how that's.
so my question, it feels like there can be like I can be performing as something, but even by virtue of using that language, it seems like I'm recognizing that I'm diverting from something else. Like even by us, and maybe this is a language constriction or something, but like even by me saying I'm performing, the idea is that I'm representing something that doesn't completely coincide with the internal content of myself or what I actually am.
That's
right?
just semantic. When we say performance,
No,
I don't believe.
think
No,
he's actually right. No,
yeah, I don't think
he's
that's
right.
semantic. I think that's very different, right? Like I don't have to quote unquote oh God. Okay, now this might get
but
semantic. But like when we look at like a method actor, right? They go and actually acquire the experiences to make themselves like a better performer. But it's almost like they're trying to change that like internal content so that they can better do the quote unquote performance, so that it's not quote unquote a performance. That like necessarily a performance is a diversion from your identity or from what you are internally. That seems to be the case. It's not like a gradual like, well, you can be more of that or less of that. It's more like, are you presenting yourself as you are, or are you like playing a different role or presenting something that doesn't match the internal subjective content or whatever. That's what it seems like.
No,
I'm
but
gonna be quite spicy with this, and I just think that you can't really be a performance. Like whatever you are isn't actually like you. Well, like I'm like kind of take an existentialist like, position on this. You're not a thing. You're an individual acting in the world. The reality of the situation is I'm the individual who's performing in order to have some sort of social engagement with another, so that I can feel some sort of experience within our culture and our environment. What I am is the chooser who's choosing to act as that performer rather than the performance itself. And so if I constantly look towards that performance to find myself, I will feel like inauthentic. I'll feel bad faith. I'll feel like I'm constantly sacrificing myself to social norms. But if I don't accept them at all, then what I'll feel is absolutely misunderstood. No one will understand me at all. I will feel unrecognized and not a part of society at all.
No, but okay, but do you believe that the type of being at home that you're talking about is governed like by genetics, or do you think that is developed through social conditions?
Oh, social conditions. I mean, like, I think that, like, so for example, like Destiny said before, like, could, like, people say to him, I think, like social conditions, can we not socially condition people? Like, like if they're social conditions, maybe it's all malleable. Like we can socially condition other things. And it's like, right, like, look, but if environment can have a massive impact, like you can't socially condition like toast back to bread. The reality is that the individual psyche may be malleable at certain points and then maybe not so malleable at others. But even if it was, it comes with ethical considerations. Let's say gay conversion therapy was actually successful, which it's not.
Right. This
but
is
let's
just
say that it
rehashing
was.
what I like. We're in total agreement here. This is basically what I said to Destiny before. So I think we agree. The only distinction lies in whether it is possible to seriously identify as something if you do not have that quote unquote at home.
So it would seem that from what I believe, and I think what perspective philosophy is arguing, and this is where the distinction comes in. Like the very fundamental question we were asking in the beginning had to do with Demon Mama saying you are whatever you identify as. But my rejection of that, and I think perspective philosophy's objection to that, is that there is some internal thing that you are, and that is a thing that exists. So you can't merely just say that that thing is whatever you identify as, because if you identify as something that doesn't match that internal thing, then you are performing. It's a different type of thing that's going on. So I can identify as an attack helicopter or a deer or whatever, but that doesn't actually match or map onto any internal experience I have. Now it's become something different.
Right. Okay. So I think I agree in that. It's what I was saying basically, that when you, so if, for example, you're lying, like, I'm not saying this is specifically true of Demon Mama, so I just won't use them as an example, but someone, for example, who is performing, who doesn't feel that at homeness, they are assigning meaning to the term woman that is not shared and is not genuinely partaking in what people understand to be womanhood.
Well, but this is boring, because now we're just saying that, like, oh, well, when they say woman, they're just they basically redefine it as meaning a performance. But that's not
exactly. But that's what I'm saying that they're doing. So
but that's not what they think they're doing,
not genuinely. Right? But I agree with you that they are not. I'm just coming to accept what you're saying. I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Okay. Sure.
Yes.
I guess the only thing I would add is like when we say that there is this internal thing from which they are, I would say the reality is that their understanding of themselves is actually seen through this socio-cultural lens. And so like the issue is that the feelings of inauthenticity, and I think this is what trans people really suffer with, and this is why it's such a a genuine issue, like an issue for them in many ways, and why it can be so painful is because when you actually look at yourself through a socio-political lens, regardless of how you understand yourself, you'll never actually meet the criteria. The if you judge yourself from the criteria of you are a woman and you have this idea of a woman in your head and you're going to try and match onto it, you're never going to be that. It's not an actual thing. Like it's a destruction of a thing. What you are is like an infinite like object. You are the chooser, and you can choose to be whatever you want to be in some respects, but that choice is really regulated whether it brings good or bad outcomes, whether it's actually making you feel at home or making you feel like inauthentic. And so if you start like it's all like socio-politically governed, how you understand yourself socio-politically governed, it's complex as fuck. And the reality is that people just need to really work through a lot of issues in sort of society.
Yeah, so to hop on that, from my understanding of what a trans person is, there is a very real internal understanding of gender.
there is a male or female internal understanding of gender, and that is why gender dysphoria exists, is because you might have the external appearance or the sex organs of being a male or female, and you might even quote unquote play the part, and it might even be socially reinforced to some extent, but if it doesn't match that internal understanding of what your gender is, it becomes self-destructive, which is why these people should have like access to HRT, SRS, GS, whatever. Like that's why we like help people transition or whatever. It's because that external doesn't match the internal content.
Yes, to some degree. I would say that the internal content is really like, although they may experience it as like thinking of themselves as a thing, in reality, it's thinking of themselves experiencing life as that thing and having that, ability to feel as if they're being seen for what they want to be. So in reality, it's a desire to be something rather than actually being something. It's like, I want to be seen as this thing from which I desire to be, rather than I am this thing. Why can't you see it?
Okay, can I then
Well,
ask
wait,
a
what is that?
question?
Hold on, wait, what is that? What do you mean by though? Like, because it feels to me like, or this might be a semantic distinction. It feels like there is a thing internally, some mental state internally that can be defined as like a male or female like mental state. It seems to be, but this might be semantic. You can explain it again, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the internal, like, this is the internal state, is one I would say that was intentional, as in like a drive, rather than like descriptive. It's not as if I am thinking in a way that's like I am a man because I think in a masculine way. It's that my intentional states align with masculinity, and that's what makes me a man.
Okay, what was Rem's question?
Well, I was going to ask, so for example, I identify as non-binary, which doesn't really even feel like an identification at all, but I suppose it is. It's obviously a very different type of identification than identifying as man or woman, which is interesting to me. But I also identify as gay, but I don't identify as a man. And would you say that that is acceptable insofar as the fact that I identify with very specific things in gay culture and I perform as that, and I do feel sort of this oneness with being gay, but I at the same time don't feel that with being a man? Do you think that there's a contradiction here, or do you think that's legitimate?
Are you
Both
asking me
of
on
you.
Destiny? Oh, right.
Both.
Okay.
Well, actually, let's hear
Ooh.
Destiny's perspective
Yeah.
first.
I don't know how you can be a non-binary gay. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I don't have a strong attachment to my gender, but I consider myself to be like bisexual or pansexual or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Because
It's
like
just-
I felt like if I was gay, that seems to necessitate some understanding of my like gender in relation to somebody else.
Well, this is the thing, but I feel this is the thing, is like, how do we evaluate this? Because I feel like what you're describing, I have this oneness with identifying as gay. I feel like I have that. I don't feel that towards pansexuality. I don't feel that towards bisexuality.
But I think that this aligns with what I was kind of saying. Like, it has more to do with the intentional states. Like, you see yourself as aligning with the intentional states of like a gay man, but
But
like,
I don't. No, but
but
not.
you don't accept the masculinity like that is implicit in the description. So like, what you would want really is like, to be entirely honest with you, is you're making what we would consider before in terms of that connection that was you're seeing like you're ascribing to gayness, but then you are not necessarily carrying forward all of the norms and conventions, and you're like, look, gayness doesn't have to actually actualize in the world like this. And that's fair enough, because then what you're doing is you're actually like, you're talking in a way which is understandable when you say I'm gay, but you say that, look, I'm attracted to men, I agree with these norms and conventions, these are what I feel at home in, however I don't agree with the necessarily masculine.
I guess it's part of the fact, I think gayness in general, I think there's more to it than simply the attraction. That might be
100%.
illegitimate.
I
Yeah, like
completely agree.
there's a very clear culture there that is gay culture that I very much identify with. Well,
People's identities change massively when they finally accept themselves, and I think that could not be explained with feeling. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say finish. I'm sorry, just keep cutting you off. Go ahead. Sorry.
I just realize that, oh, I'm actually like guys. Like, that would be different than your whole understanding of self changing. Like, there is a lot more conceptual connections with like the nexus web of concepts that form your identity than just like replacing the concept of like the heteronormative concept of like woman with man or something.
I think
so
something
then
in terms
Destiny,
of
do you
in terms
agree
of
with this?
sexual engagement, I actually just something I just think about. I actually agree with that really hardcore. When I am
I don't
having
know how, Destiny. You're
what-
contradicting because you
hold
weren't
on,
you the
I'm
person
about
who
to
said you
explain.
can't-
Hold on, I was
Okay.
about to explain. Yeah. So when I am fucking a woman, especially a very feminine woman, I feel incredibly straight at that point in time. If I have somebody that's smaller than me, that has long hair, smooth skin or whatever, like it makes me feel very masculine, and then the role that I'll play sexually becomes like very stereotypical masculine, and then the role that the other plays can become very stereotypically feminine. So like in that particular moment, I don't really feel like a bisexual, pansexual person. I feel like a masculine, straight man at that moment. But if I'm hooking up with a guy, the feeling that I have and the engagement in that moment is way, 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 way different. At that point, I don't feel straight or bi. Like, I guess you could argue I feel gay or whatever. So it seems like, I guess, this is just like the own like kind of internal workings of my mind, I guess, as I move through these types of like sexual situations. It doesn't seem to be the case that like at all points in my life, I feel like, oh, I'm bisexual, pansexual, non-binary, blah, blah, blah. It seems like based on, I guess, what particular activity I'm in, I guess I have like a different feeling of what exactly is going on.
100%.
Yeah.
I think that
Right.
that's gotta be the case, and I think that's really the main thrust of like I brought up Foucault before in terms of like discipline and punishment. Like our identity is malleable to he even says the architecture of where we are. Like the norms and conventions of wherever we're actually like existing have a direct effect on how we understand ourselves in that environment.
Okay, but Destiny, then you do believe that you can be a femboy woman, right?
Well, it becomes semantic. Because
Well,
when somebody
this
says
is
they're
what
a
I-
woman, I feel like they have the
I'm not trying to
internal.
do a gotcha.
No,
I'm
I
just
understand.
trying to see
I'm
if
just
you
saying,
would
just my answer is
change.
going to be depending on what you mean by femboy woman, right? Because the reason why I rejected that category is because usually when you call yourself a femboy, the boy means you have the internal experience of being a man, but usually when you call yourself a woman, it means you have the internal experience of being a woman. So that's why I rejected that term. Kind of like
But let me push back on that because it's the same thing if I'm identifying as a gay, non-binary person. It's the same type of situation because there are aspects of femboy that is more than simply
No.
what you're
To be clear,
describing,
no.
which has to do with culture, no?
Hold on. Sexual orientations and sexual identities are two dramatically different things to me. So when you call yourself like a non-binary gay person, like for you to be gay feels like that's a relational thing to somebody else. I don't know if you can be independently gay. Like that feels like it has to be in relation to another thing. Whereas like a femboy woman, that feels like something that you're talking about two contrary identities there. You're not talking about an orientation plus another type of identity. That's why that feels separate to me or different to me.
I feel like you then disagree with respect to philosophy and I if you think that I can't be independently gay outside of a relationship that I'm in. Because
Well, if you want to argue that a femboy woman might be somebody
that
that is like fluidly, like at some points they feel like a woman and at some points they feel like a man, that'd be some. But femboy woman implies both identities simultaneously, which seems contradictory to me. That's
well,
why.
but I think what
You see,
perspective philosophy and I are pushing is that there's something more to it than simply the narrow orientation that you're just like being gay is more than simply being attracted to men as a man
Well,
in
yes,
that it
but
encompasses more cultural aspects to it.
I completely agree, but it's the whole understanding of norms and conventions as a nexus and how we move out of certain norms and conventions into others. Like, so for example, even as a straight guy, you may change your behavior when you walk into a gay club, or you might or if you walked into like, a certain, like, I don't know, like for example, even, like, let's even moved away from gender. Like, let's say I walked into somewhere like a church versus like walking into like, I don't know, a nightclub. Like, they're very different environments that are going to have direct impacts upon how I understand myself within that environment. Like when we talk about something like gender identity, and this is why I think intentional state is very, very important. The reality is you are never actually an object. You are the person, as in the chooser, moving between environments of normative construction in which you're trying to express your subjectivity. So when I walk into a church versus I walk into a nightclub, I have very different intentional states depending on the norms and conventions and the meanings I'm trying to express with my actions. So
I don't
when
know if I agree because you are suggesting I can't be gay and non-binary
no,
at the same time.
quite the this is this is the thing. Like if you have two, like it's like you could have two contradictory notions that are applying at the same time, and in which case I'm not saying that they don't necessarily apply at all, but I'm saying that you would, and I think you agreed with this before, that the individual would have to be trying to create some either radical definition change or change and express the norms and conventions of our society differently. It's like moving between, like, you're essentially creating a new space within the normative nexus.
But then it sounds like that there are some forms of identity, and this is why I draw orientation as being separate than like a different type of identity. It seems like there are some identities that you can't just simply move in and out of, or actually maybe you would disagree with that. Maybe you're saying that there are areas where a trans person could move to. They're just not in this current reality, I guess, that where they could
that's
move.
what you're
and
saying
not film.
about bread and toast, right?
Well, yeah,
But
I mean, like that. Look, if
toast
you
can't
were to
become
like,
bread again.
well, that's the thing. Like, imagine if you were to like, I could say you're a trans person within our society, and then you go to an entirely different society, and the concept of gender might exist, but you might not. You might feel less at home, and let's say like in like their concept of femininity than masculinity, then it will have a radically different experience for you. So, like, for example, if I go to like a culture in which, like, let's say I was I was trans and I wanted to be feminine, but then I went to a culture in which where women like act in a way which we would consider masculine, then I'm going to be very confused because I'm like, wait a minute, this is exactly the opposite from what I felt at home in my own culture. And I think that that's just the reality of the situation. Like, the signifiers and the behaviors themselves are really expressions of our internal intentional states and our attempts to express our subjectivity, rather than objects or like, for example, brain structures or objects or whatever it may be.
Real quick, each of you can take a last word on this, and then I've got to dip on this. Go.
You want to go first?
I don't even, I just think that like gender identity in terms of is really just an intentional state in which an individual like identifies with a certain normative engagement with that society and that culture, and they try and express that subjectivity. It has to be endorsed internally and expressed performatively, and that's what gender identity is. And same with any other identity, to be entirely honest with you.
I mean, I think I don't know if I totally. I think I have some, and we can discuss this later, some lingering disagreements, because I feel like phenomenologically, what I experience as someone who does identify as both gay and non-binary doesn't really map on to this type of nexus picture that you're describing. But we can talk about that later. Anyways,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
been a great conversation, the both of you. The only shout out I have is to follow me on Twitter, I guess, because I don't stream anymore, which is Bath_boy with an I. So there you go.
Yeah. Also follow me on YouTube, which is Perspective Philosophy. Yeah. Oh, thanks anyway, guys. I really did appreciate it, and thanks for joining us in.
Thanks, Destiny. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay, I love you guys. Be careful. Bye.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
I'm gonna pull up YouTube chat. Let's see. I'm just kidding. I'm not looking at YouTube chat.